Gaming is a hobby many of us enjoy, and for most of us, it's a hobby that we have enjoyed for the majority of our lives. The video game industry has grown and changed so much since the start of our fandom, and we have all grown and changed with it. But how did us growing up affect the games that we played? And how did the games industry's growth affect us as we grew? Welcome to Insert Coin, where we take a walk down memory lane to answer those very questions and discuss our personal history with video games. One quarter at a time. Hey, what's up, and welcome to episode 5 of Insert Coin, the interview show where we divide our lives into quarters and talk about all the games and systems we loved during those times. Joining me today is a very special guest, co-host of one of the longest running gaming podcasts in the world, Player One Podcast, also the best game journalist I've ever seen in person, a man whose main major export is everything there is to know about the Sega Genesis. He literally does what Nintendo don't. Ladies and gentlemen, Greg Sewart. How you doing, Greg?
Good. Thanks for having me. That's the nicest intro I've ever had.
Nice. I have a script for that intro right in front of me. I was reading off it. Before we jump into the interview, though, I'll give you a quick breakdown on how this show works. It's pretty simple. What we do is we divide the guest's age by 4 and use each quarter of our lives as a jump-in point to chat about all the games we loved and the fond memories we had gaming during those times. So with that being said, Greg, all I need from you is the year that you were born, if you're comfortable disclosing that information.
Yeah, sure. It's 1976.
1976. So that would put the first quarter between 1976 and 1987. Before we start talking about it, though, let's put one coin into the arcade time machine that we have with us and take a quick peek into what gaming was like from 1976 to 1987. I hope you like this, Greg. I made this for you.
Which of these games is the closest thing to the real thing? A, in television Major League Baseball. B,
Dragon Quest 2 悪霊の神々
Hey Joey, what's she really like?
She's the most exciting woman I ever met.
Yeah?
Atari introduces the Woman of the Year, Ms. Pac-Man.
Honey, don't you know I'm more than Pac-Man with a bow?
Reach for Ms. Pac-Man.
Reach for Atari.
E.T. video game?
It's the video game that lets you pretend you're E.T., running away from secret agents, falling into danger, finding a phone to call home, and discovering the best thing on earth, a friend. E.T., only from Atari.
So you think you're fast enough to beat the bomber? I don't think so.
Kaboom! By Activision. Don't sneeze. Don't even blink. Because the faster you get, the faster he gets.
And if you miss...
Kaboom! By Activision.
Watch Zelda become a legend on your Nintendo Entertainment System.
Zelda!
Which way you go?
Good times.
Sleepers!
Zelda!
The Legend of Zelda. A never-ending adventure new for your Nintendo Entertainment System.
Zelda!
You are playing with power.
Punch-Out by Nintendo.
Play with power.
11 world-class contenders. Beat them all, and you've got a shot at Tyson's title.
Power.
But for that, you've got to beat Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power.
Do you have ice hockey by Activision?
Think you're ready for it? One of the roughest video games around for your Atari game system? Ready to battle for the puck?
Well...
To inflict fierce body checking? Furious stick checking? Ruthless tripping! You really think you're ready for all that?
I'm ready!
They're moving real fast, they're the only ones who can get there on time. Okay, sis. And never too far behind, they are always fighting crime.
Stop time, Dan. Ready when you are, Rhodey.
In the danger zone. Pretty soon they'll be off on a mission.
Hydrofoil mode, Rhodey.
Hydrofoil engaged, Dan.
What's behind wheels? Hovercraft, quick!
What's behind this show? Only there are the knows. Sit back and watch them go.
1976 to 1987, the era where an alien from outer space tried to kill console gaming as we know it. And it would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for one brave Italian plumber. Greg, in this era of your gaming life, what devices did you game on? What was your favorite? And do you remember how you got them?
Yeah, for the most part, I was playing on the Atari 2600 in the very early 80s. I'm just, by the way, just sitting here listening to that intro, and it's just like I'm like watching cartoons on Saturday morning, eating a bowl of like Fruit Loops, and because I mean, Pole Position. Oh my God!
You know what? I tried my hardest to figure out where in Pole Position the song was the best place to like cut because I didn't want to play the whole song. And there wasn't a best place. I had to play the whole song. I literally played the whole song. So that's why it was like the longest one. But that was the first time I heard it too when you showed it to me. So I had to include that. I was waiting for the end. I couldn't wait for the end for you to see it. But anyway.
There's nothing to do with the video game, but
no,
such an amazing intro. Yeah, no, I mean, from back early, I don't even remember where we got our 2600. I actually, before when we were talking about me coming on this show, my mom happened to be over, and I was just like, do you remember where we got our Atari 2600? And she was telling me that my dad had bought it with my uncle when he was like in the 70s, when he was like 18. So that's why we had it. But that's what I spent the earliest part of my life playing was on Atari 2600. Between that and my stepdad also had it, and I played a lot of Dodgem, Combat, Centipede, Frogger, Kaboom, which you had in that intro as well, which I absolutely loved. Anything from Activision was great back then. But you know what I really played with the most during this quarter was the NES, for sure. I mean, that was what got me into video games. I mean, I liked video games. You know, I liked playing Atari, and I was pretty young when the crash had happened. And of course, the fallout of the crash was that games were super cheap. Because everyone was trying to really, you go to like Zellers, old Canadians will know the name Zellers, and there'd be like a bin of new Atari games or anything, Coleco and Television, whatever what they had left. Basically, they were trying to get rid of that you could get for like pennies, right? Like I think like $1 or
really
something
pennies.
Like that. Yeah, I mean they were trying to get rid of them. They were poisonous at that point. So a lot of friends that I knew had just like my friend Dave, his parents had a cedar chest full of loose Atari 2600 games. They must have had 100.
Really?
But they didn't buy them when they were new. They bought them after the crash. So, you know, me and my friends all played games then, and we liked them, but it was more of like we're 6-7 years old and video games are cool. But getting my Nintendo, my brother and I getting our Nintendo was when I sort of fell in love with video games for sure.
So just for people that might not know exactly what the crash is that he's referring to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because this is just me. I didn't live it, so this is just kind of like secondhand knowledge. But basically, a movie came out called E.T. You might have heard of it. It's a pretty big movie, and it was super successful at the box office, as you can imagine. So obviously, they wanted to make a video game version of this, but the problem is they decided to make the game. You probably know the exact time here, but it was like a couple months or something like that before Christmas.
Some ridiculous amount of
time. It was like late summer, I think, and they wanted it out in time for like Black Friday, Christmas. So they just figured they can make whatever they can do in that amount of time, regardless if it's good or not, and they can sell it for how much was like a retail game back then?
Oh, I don't know. But I did something in one of my YouTube videos recently. I was looking at that, and the prices were dropping. I think it was like $39. Americans, are probably like $40 Canadian.
Yeah, which is probably like rough,
Canadian.
like with inflation, it's probably close to what a game is today, like $90 after tax or whatever. So they want to just basically sell garbage for $90, and everyone bought it because everyone knows ET is awesome or whatever. And a lot of people were disappointed with that, and it really made them feel like they kind of got swindled and lost their money, and then they stopped trusting games because there wasn't like a Nintendo seal of approval or anything like that. It was really kind of the wild west. So people got disenfranchised with that when they know that they could spend that much money and potentially get something that's pretty garbage.
Yeah, and the ET game is kind of the ultimate. It was kind of the final straw, but I think it's interesting when you really look back at that era that ET gets blamed for that, but it was kind of like, I think, the straw that broke the camel's back. Like if you look at things like Pac-Man on the Atari 2600, I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's absolutely awful.
Really?
And yeah, it's terrible. I love it, but it was because it was a chance to play Pac-Man at home. It's nothing like the arcade game. And I forget the name of the guy at Atari who ported it, but it was another example of what you were talking about, where they got the license because Pac-Man was massive. I mean, Pac-Man fever was a thing, and basically gave this guy, I think his name was Todd, I can't remember his last name, gave this guy like a couple weeks or something ridiculous, where he just threw it together, because Atari programmers at that time too, they were making royalties based on how their games sold. So this actually made this guy a lot of money, and it was Pac-Man, and it didn't matter how good it was because it was Pac-Man, right? So he threw something together, it went out the door, it sold really well. But I think if you look at stuff like that, you start to realize like they were already chipping away at the goodwill in the early 80s, even before ET happened. And ET was just, again, like I said, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, at the same time, the market was being flooded with, once Activision opened the doors and made it legal for third parties to release games on the 2600, everybody was doing it. Like Chase the Chuck Wagon. There was a game that a dog food company put out. You know what I mean? Like everybody was putting out games because it was just a license to print money. And so, yeah, I mean, again, ET was kind of the one everyone points to, and Howard Scott Warshaw, who created that game, has kind of traded on that fact. I mean, he just released a book called Once Upon Atari, and he talks all about that. And actually, that's based on a DVD documentary series he did called Once Upon Atari that I highly recommend, where he interviews a bunch of people he used to work with at Atari, and that story about Pac-Man is in there as well. So I mean, it was everyone was just trying to make a buck as fast as they could on that, because it was everyone always believed it was going to be a fad, right?
Right.
So.
But then a little man in Japan named Shigeru Miyamoto teamed up with a really brave and awesome plumber, and he got you a Nintendo Entertainment System. Do you remember how that transaction occurred?
I absolutely do, and it's one of my favorite stories. So my brother and I got our Nintendo, I want to say in like 87 or 88. So it was right at the end of this. So we went a long time without having any video games. And of course, I was in elementary school at the time. So, I had friends that had an NES, and so did my brother, and we both desperately wanted one. And but I mean, we were like my parents were divorced by that point. We were a single income family. My dad and my uncle ran a race team, a race car, so that's where all their money went. And my brother was also in hockey, so there wasn't a lot of extra money around, so we didn't get a Nintendo. And one Christmas we had both asked for it and we didn't get one. And it was, I don't remember how soon it was after, but I want to say it was like a week after Christmas. We got into a conversation with my dad. There was no kicking and screaming and fighting, but we had badgered him for a week saying, we want a Nintendo. We want a Nintendo. And my dad, who was not a stupid man, said, okay, look, if you can find one for sale tonight, this was probably about 5 p.m. So, and stores would have been open until about 9. If you can find one for sale tonight, I will buy it for you. And This was right after Christmas, and this was when Nintendo was like the hottest toy. So what he knew is that it wasn't possible.
Because there's no internet. You can't check store stock online.
Right. It was not going to be possible for us to find one. So my brother and I worked the phone for 2.5 hours, calling every store that we could think of in the yellow pages. And we found one in a place called Penhorn Mall, which was the next city over in Dartmouth. I'm in Halifax, and the next
Big
city
fan
over
of
in
the
Dartmouth.
playground over at Penhorn Mall.
There you go. We found one. It was an action set. It was the one that came with the zapper, not the robot, but just the zapper. So Duck Hunt and Mario Brothers. And my dad was a man of his word. It was in a blizzard. And we went out and climbed in the car in the middle of the night in the snowstorm. And this was an old Oldsmobile that he had that the passenger side door didn't even work. So we would pull the window down and climb in through the window like the Dukes of Hazzard.
Oh my God.
And drove over to Dartmouth and bought our Nintendo Entertainment System. And that's how I got into video games. And that's how we got our Nintendo.
Nothing will stop you.
No, it was amazing. And then we got to listen to my dad talk about how talk himself into it. It's like, oh, it's really good for hand-eye coordination. So this is a good idea anyway. So
It's true.
Yeah.
I use that all the time and try to justify how much I play video games. Do you remember any like marquee? Like I'm assuming the zapper came with the Mario Duck Hunt combo, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we played a lot of that right off the bat. But up until that point, my cousin had an NES, and we didn't have Nintendo Power up here at the time, but we had a free newsletter called Nintendo Power Flash. So it was like if you registered your system, they basically would take some pages of Nintendo Power in the United States and would repackage them as these, like, I have a couple of these around. They're like these 10-page newsletters, but then it was like, branded for Canada. So it was Nintendo Power Flash, it was called. The letters were all from Canadian players and stuff like that. And, but it would be like, here's 4 pages of Zelda 2 maps. You know what I mean? Like that sort of stuff that they would take out of Nintendo Power. So that's what he was playing at the time when we got our NES. So that whatever year that came out is probably the year we got our Nintendo. So I was all about playing Zelda 2. So that was one of the very first games that we ended up getting for it. That and Simon's Quest, actually, Castlevania 2 were the 2 like very first games that I got for my Nintendo. And those games are both like the black sheep of their respective franchises, and I adore both of them just because they were like my first big Nintendo games at the time. So yeah.
So what do you think? Like since you kind of were gaming before and after the almost death of gaming, what is it? Just that Mario is so good and the console itself was so fun to play that kind of pulled people or changed people's perception, or like is there something with the marketing? Like what was it like to kind of, or maybe you never even lost faith in video games, although you did say that you didn't play a ton until you got the NES. But what was it that kind of that you think that kind of changed people's minds about the hobby in general, or like the quality of what you're buying?
I think those of us who were Nintendo kids, at least my generation, I mean, we're all old enough to have played Atari 2600 and ColecoVision and Intellivision and things like that, but we really weren't old enough to be aware of what was going on. You know what I mean? Like, I know for me personally, I was like under 10 years old when the crash happened. So, I mean, I wasn't really aware that video games ever really went away. But from a non-business standpoint, and I think it's pretty obvious to see, if you turn on, like, say, Pitfall on the 2600, that's great. It's a great game, and it plays all right with that old joystick. But, like, when you put on Super Mario Brothers next to that, there's really no comparison. I mean, It was a quantum leap ahead, right? It was really new, and it felt very high tech compared to what we had been playing. Because up until that point, those of us who were old enough to remember, by the time we were playing that the original sort of generation of consoles, they were like 7 or 8 years old. Right. And I know that when the NES came here, it was pretty old as well. It was like 3 or 4 years old before it actually got released in North America, but it still was such a quantum leap forward from what we had been playing. Like you had music that sounded more like music, and you had so many colors, and you had like really smooth scrolling on the Nintendo, which you didn't have on most games for the 2600. The 2600 library was so made up. The good games were so made up of those single screen arcade games, which were great. Mm-hmm. But they were big and blocky, and they only looked like the arcade game in as much as you could sort of envision that they looked like the arcade game. Whereas, you play Pac-Man on the NES, or Miss Pac-Man, or Galaga, or any of those, and they looked pretty much like what you were playing in the arcade.
Right.
So I think that was the big thing.
Yeah, I remember like I'm a huge fan of like Doom and id and like their history. I kind of watched and read a lot about that, and I remember before they formed id, when they worked at I think it was a magazine. I can't remember the name of it. You probably do. But they were really like being like basically a rocket scientist. Like John Carmack's literally a rocket scientist. He saw the smooth scrolling that you were mentioned in Mario and thought that was insane, because he's used to working on PCs, which were on paper like more powerful than an NES by a lot. Like they're like raw computational power, but there was nothing on PC that could do that. There's no games that could do that, and he had to like basically like use like bubble gum and duct tape to try to get like a Mario clone to kind of resemble that, and he ended up turning that into like a profitable game. I think what is it called? It's like the Invader, or it's Captain something. It's basically a Mario clone. I can't believe I'm blanking on it, but anyway, that ended up spawning into making enough money to kind of make it, and the rest is history there. So that must have been a pretty big leap. But my question is like, how do you, as a 9-year-old, and your brother, I don't know if he's older or younger, but I'm assuming he's close to 9 at that point, how do you go from knowing what a Atari looks like and plays like to wanting the NES? Like, was there like kiosks in stores? Did your buddies have them? Or like, because like, I don't think that, I mean, maybe you can kind of get the sense of that quantum leap that you're talking about from a commercial on TV. But I don't know. Like, I wasn't really paying attention to commercials when I was a kid. So like, that isn't the stuff that would grab me. It was going to Future Shop and playing the demo in the kiosk and stuff like that.
Right. I'm sure that there were store displays. That was probably a big part of it. Probably at like a Radio Shack or something like that. I know I spent a lot of the 80s and 90s sort of staring longingly at computer games at Radio Shack, because they always had those sort of running on a loop and everything, more in the 90s. But commercials were definitely part of it. Like, when you'd see commercials for, say, Mike Tyson, I mean, it looked like a cartoon, right? But the big thing was really that cousin that I talked about. When we would go visit them, they had a Nintendo. So that's where I got to experience it and, sort of fell in love with it. Plus, peer pressure is a huge factor at that age, and the NES was like the most popular toy. So we had lots of friends that had an NES. So you had a chance to go over, not only a chance to go over and play it, but also there was an element of being part of the group. And I mean, one of my dearest friends and one of my most important friendships in my life completely started because I had a Nintendo. It was, it was my friend Dave. We had been friends. We'd been going to school together since primary, but and we would hang out a little bit. But I remember vividly, like in the schoolyard, whichever school I was at the time, him talking to another mutual friend about whatever Nintendo game they were playing. And it was one that I was playing at the same time. And I just sort of stepped into the conversation and said, oh yeah, I'm playing that too. And this is, they were stuck on something and I was trying to help. And I remember Dave turned to me and said, you have a Nintendo? And I said, yeah. And we like spent every weekend together from that point on renting games, because that was the other big thing to do back then. I know that you're big into Game Pass and everything like that. But of course, like, before Game Pass, you would go rent games on the weekend. And that's what we would do. Like Friday night after school and after supper, we would get one of our parents to drive us to the rental place. We'd pick a game we hadn't played or a game we were trying to play through, rent it for 2 days, either come to my place, go to his place, sleepovers, play through that game. And that was it.
Yeah. I mean, Game Pass is great. Don't get me wrong, but I am not that young. I had a Blockbuster membership. Okay. I was there when 7-day rentals came out. I was on the front lines for that. So I was a big renter too. Another question I had, because when I was playing games a lot, like mostly in the 90s, and there were still arcades in the 90s. But to be honest, in the 90s, for me anyway, in my experience, arcades, unless you went to like a mega arcade like Palladium or something like that, the arcades machines that you would see at like a pizza place or a campground or a mall. Although Sparkles was pretty good. I'm sure
Sparkles
you know about.
Was great.
Yeah, I'm sure you know about that. But for the most part, in the 90s, for me, arcade machines were kind of a little bit like mobile games. They're games that they're fun to play and you can play them when you're not at your console or not at your TV. But I know in the 70s and 80s that arcade machines, like they were part of the reason why people had lost trust with console games, because the experiences were just not the same. I feel like back then, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like back then arcade and console games was like the equivalent of watching a DVD at your home versus going to the movie theater.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good comparison, actually. I mean, like I was saying earlier, like some of the older arcade games look pretty damn close on an NES, which was great. You know, like Centipede. I don't know if Centipede's on the NES, but anyway, like Pac-Man and Galaga and stuff like that. But pretty quickly, the arcade machine started to outstrip the console. But it was kind of just an accepted thing, and honestly, it's something that I think console manufacturers in general were trading on. I know Sega did in a big way, sort of traded on the whole, like, we're closer to the arcade than that one is, right? I mean, Sega's whole tagline when the Genesis and Mega Drive came out was bringing the arcade home. So yeah, I mean, if you wanted the premium experience, you went to the arcade. Just like you just said, like if you want the proper movie experience, you go to a movie theater. You know, watching it on, especially back then, on your little CRT at home was not the same thing.
No.
You know, same thing with video games for sure.
Right. Okay. And then, yeah, with the NES, you could say that the gap between like the gap between like arcades and consoles starts to get closer. And then you start to weigh like, oh, do I really want to put my coat and boots on? Do I really want to use all my quarters? I need to buy milk at school tomorrow. Like what? But yeah. So I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of trajectory throughout that era. The final question I have in terms of Q1 is you had mentioned like obviously you got like Mario and Duck Hunt. You said Simon's Quest and Zelda 2. I was just wondering before we move on if there was any other games that stood out to you and from that era as being really important things or games that provide you with really lasting memories or moments that you can recall.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there were a ton. I would say probably top of mind would be Mega Man 2. Actually, Mega Man 2, and there's another game called Faksanity, which I'm sure I'm not saying right. But that sort of goes along with the story of when Nintendo Power actually came to Canada, which was a complete surprise. I don't know if it was common knowledge that they were coming or not, but like 12-year-old me definitely didn't know. And the whole reason that sticks out on my mind is because I actually had the chicken pox when I was 12 years old, which used to be common, but it isn't anymore. You know, medical.
I tried to get them more than once. I wanted to stay home, play video games, but
exactly. And
vaccines.
I remember I was home alone, 12 years old, apparently old enough to stay home alone because my parents worked. And my dad tossed this package on my bed as he was leaving for work. And I'm assuming that means the mail must have shown up the day before. And I open it up and it's Nintendo Power. And I was like, what's this? And he's like, I don't know. It was addressed to you. And what it was again, anyone who had Nintendo Power Flash got the first issue of Nintendo Power that was released in Canada for free. And the cover was Mega Man 2. And I had seen the first Mega Man. I mean, nowadays, you know, the cover of the first Mega Man on NES is a joke, right? I mean, it's so god awful looking, but completely unironically, like my friends and I had never touched Mega Man because of that cover. We never rented it. It looked awful, right? So as funny as it is now, it absolutely worked in the fact that if the cover was terrible, we didn't look at the game. So anyway, Mega Man 2 was on the cover. And of course, anyone who read Nintendo Power back then, when they covered a game, it was literally a strategy guide. And you would have full color maps of every level in the game. And it ran through, I think maybe the only thing it didn't cover was Dr. Wily's castle. And it looked amazing. Like the graphics on Mega Man 2 were out of this world. They were so good. And so I was on a quest to rent Mega Man 2, and it was super popular, probably because of that. So we ended up renting Mega Man because it's like, well, you can't get 2; it's never in. Let's rent Mega Man, and we sort of got into the franchise that way. And Faksanity was another one where it was covered in that issue. It looked really interesting to me. It's, you know, side-scrolling, sort of almost a Metroid-style game, but with more fantasy trappings like swords and magic and things like that. So I ended up buying that sort of sight unseen based on the maps in that magazine alone. So those two games really stand out because that was also sort of my introduction to video game magazines. At the same time, I hadn't really bought video game magazines, and there weren't really a whole ton of them around in the late 80s. So those two games in particular stand out. But I mean, like, Final Fantasy was sort of my intro to RPGs. I was super excited about that. Again, Nintendo Power kind of really amped me up on Final Fantasy, and I had played Dragon Warrior with my friend Dave. Anything from Capcom, really, besides Mega Man, like DuckTales was huge for me. And
Great
also,
theme song.
yeah, and also Batman by Sunsoft also stands out for me because, you know, Tim Burton's Batman came out in 89, I think, which is kind of out of this quarter, but still part of the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I'll play anything that has Batman in it now because that movie was so cool and so popular.
The anti ET game.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, that wraps up quarter number 1, and we're going to slide into quarter number 2, which will cover 1988 to 1999. But before we do, let's put another coin into that arcade time machine and take a quick look into that era of gaming.
Hey guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
What's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
Wait, kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis.
Did you ever try to get to level 10 in your underwear, boy?
Across endless land and water, you search. Deep into a parallel world where light becomes dark, you search. And just when you think your search has ended, you find it's just begun. The new Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. Now you're playing with power and superpower.
Super Mario All-Star, so much Mario, it's a Mario smorgasbord. It's all the way down Mario Brothers Adventures you ever played and then some. But this is two-star 16-bit only on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System Mario. So it's bigger Mario, better Mario, in-your-face Mario. It's Raccoon Mario, Mario throwing fireballs, Mario hurling turnips, Mario negotiating an arms deal. Okay, maybe not. It's Mario like you've never seen him with 2 + 2 Mario. It's the capital of Ohio Mario. You're gonna live, breathe, eat, sleep Mario. In Super Mario All-Stars, 4 Mario games, including the never-before-seen lost levels, so you can't get more Mario than this, which is why the best played here.
There today, folks, people are driving like animals. The turnpike split in two and a turtle shell is making travel impossible for one motorist. Over on the freeway, it's bumper to bumper, door to door, wheel to wheel, you name it. And check your rear view, some blockheads are causing major delays. There's already been one accident there. And watch out over on I-94, a banana field is making things a little slippery. And that's traffic.
With two-player split-screen action, you've never been in a race like this.
1988 to 1999. It can't be all fun and games forever as 2 Japanese corporations battle it out in one of the first big public console wars. It was Hedgehogs versus Goombas, Blood versus Sweat, Cool Kids versus Little Kids, Sega versus Nintendo. Tell me, Greg, in this era of your gaming life, what devices did you game on? What was your favorite? And do you remember how you got them?
I gamed on everything in the 90s. The 90s is like by far my favorite time in video games. But yeah, I was definitely a Genesis kid. I was a Nintendo kid, as we just talked about, and I was super excited about the Super Nintendo. Watching at this point all the different magazines and all the information and all the news on it and trying to figure out when it was coming out. And it wasn't back then, it wasn't like it is now where you had like this. First of all, you didn't get things sort of the same time world over. That didn't happen. Something would come out in Japan and then like the next year it would come out here. It happened with the Genesis. It happened with the Super Nintendo. Happened with the TurboGrafx. And I kind of got sick of waiting for the Super Nintendo, and there was a couple reasons for it. And one of them was that I finally started to be able to rent a Genesis. Back when you would rent consoles, I talked my dad into putting the $200 deposit on his credit card so that I could rent a Genesis for a weekend. And rented like Super Monaco GP, which was amazing. There was nothing that looked like that on the NES. And Sonic was on its way. You played that commercial in that intro with the whole like, I want Sonic. That was absolutely me. Sonic looks so cool, and Sega did such an amazing job of marketing that game and of really making it look good next to Super Mario World, which is an amazing game. Don't get me wrong, but really made it look good next to Super Mario World. And the other big thing for me was that around the same time that the Super Nintendo was coming here, the Sega CD or the Mega CD was being released in Japan. And I was sort of all in on CD gaming for some reason. It was just something that I decided I really wanted. And so I think it was, again, had to do with checking out the TurboGrafx CD a little bit and thinking like, it's so cool, Red Book audio and having real voice actors and things like that. And Sega had made it very clear the Sega CD was coming in 1992, whereas Nintendo was waffling. Nintendo announced one, and they had partnered with Sony, and it was going to be the PlayStation, and they pulled the rug out from underneath Sony, and they partnered with Philips, and then they pulled the rug out from underneath Philips and decided, no, we don't need CD. And it was like all that sort of came together to be like, I'm just going to go with the Genesis. I'm sick of waiting. The games I tried, I really liked. I ended up selling everything to buy a Genesis, sold my Game Boy, sold my NES, sold all my games, and bought a Genesis after they took Altered Beast out of the box and before they put Sonic in the box. So I literally got nothing with my system. I had no games to play when I bought my Genesis. I bought a copy of Altered Beast for $3.
Oh, that's not bad.
Through like one of those shady mail order things in the back of like EGM or something like that, like Chips and Bits or something. And that lasted 20 minutes. It got here. I played it, finished it in 20 minutes and never touched it again. But I was a big Genesis kid for the first part of the 90s. That was what I played. My buddy Dave got a Super Nintendo, and that's where I experienced those games, which is great. Between us, we sort of played everything. We shared our systems and played all the major games. And I ended up buying a Super Nintendo eventually, but I was full on into the Sega ecosystem for the first part of the 90s. Genesis, Sega CD, 32X. That was what I did from like 90 to 95.
So by the end of it, you had a mutant console with like attachments on every surface.
Tower of Power.
Nice.
Three wall warts.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's all kind of one thing that I wanted to talk on you or speak on. You mentioned your friend had a Super Nintendo as well, which you like for you, and it was for me too in that era. That was like the ideal scenario, right? I had a Super Nintendo. My friend had a Sega, and that was awesome because then we could like lend consoles to each other, and I could play both things because there was no way I was going to be able to have both of them at that time. And that is kind of counter to what the marketing was, but everyone that I know at least was the same. Did you ever encounter like any kind of console warrior type mentality between people, or was for the most part, was it because you would have been in a different kind of age bracket as well in that area? Did you ever see a lot of people like really heated and arguing about like what's better and what's not? Or was it more like, I hope my friend gets the other one because then I get to play more things?
Yeah, it was kind of more like that. And I mean, the big thing, and one of the reasons why I love the early 90s in general and the Super Nintendo and Genesis is that even when you had the same game on different consoles, they weren't necessarily the same game. You know what I mean? Like some of them were, but they had different pluses and minuses. Like Earthworm Jim, let's say, was the same game technically, but had, I think, more levels or something on the Genesis and better music on the Super Nintendo. Or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? Two games that are kind of the same, Turtles in Time and Hyperstone Heist. Turtles in Time, definitely, I think, the better game, but Hyperstone Heist plays exactly the same, but has completely different levels and completely different progression and everything like that. So kind of worth playing both of them. Or even then along the lines of like Shadowrun or Alien 3, where same license, completely different game on both consoles. So, I was a teenager during that era, and my friends, there was never any sort of angry aggressive console warrior stuff that I saw or was a part of. It was more of a one-upsmanship or like teasing each other, like, ew, you play NHL on the Super Nintendo? It sucks. Like NHL's so much better on the Genesis. You know what I mean? Like it was always that sort of thing. You know, and of course my buddies who were into like RPGs, we were all kind of into role-playing games at the time, and you needed a Super Nintendo to play the best role-playing games. That was where Square was, and that was where you're getting Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger and all that stuff. But no, for the most part, there wasn't any real system warrior stuff going. If anything, it was kind of the alternative that you said, where it's like, you know I'm going to get to play Final Fantasy 3 because my friend Dave has a Super Nintendo, and my buddy Justin would come down to my place to play NHL because it came out first on the Genesis, and that was actually the reason he ended up buying a Genesis, because he loved that game so much. Like, so we sort of got to broaden our horizons and open a lot of doors for each other gaming wise, because we as a group of friends had access to every console.
Yeah, it's really interesting because like I mostly consume these ads through like watching them 20 years later or whatever through YouTube videos. But the advertising between Sony or Sega, sorry, mostly Sega, I would say. I don't really see a lot of Nintendo ads that are super combative, although they do have a little bit. But the advertising and what they're putting out there for people to kind of consume is very aggressive in terms of like pitting themselves against each other. But then the actual gamers that are playing these games and buying these consoles aren't necessarily doing that. Whereas now, aside from like, this is how you play used games or whatever with PlayStation, other than that, the advertising is like pretty good. And like the presence of some of the leadership in those companies online are usually pretty cordial. And like that stuff is very friendly for the most part, but the gamers are like online, they're like extremely aggressive, and console war is like a plague kind of on the industry at this point. So it's just an interesting dichotomy where the marketing has softened a lot, but the actual outcome is completely different.
It was one of the things that I really loved about Sega. And if you read the book Console Wars or listen to anything that Tom Kalinske said, who was running Sega after 1990, like he sort of calls out things like, Pepsi versus Coke, and how they would constantly reference each other in their advertising, not necessarily in an aggressive way, but you'd always have that reference. And I think he cites I don't know the exact commercial, but I think it was a Nike commercial that he saw during a motel stay one night. He says was the inspiration for the whole like let's really go after Nintendo in a big way. I mean, Genesis does what Nintendo wasn't his. That happened before he got there. But it was kind of fun to be on the side of that sort of console war, where you had a company like Sega that had enough money to throw around to be successful at the time, but really had nothing to lose in this market, because they had something like 5% of the game market when the Genesis came out. Like, it was ridiculous, right? So it's like, well, if we go for broke and it doesn't work, we're really no worse off than we were. So let's just do it. And I mean, some of their advertising pushed the envelope a little bit, but I think for the most part, it was respectful enough, I guess.
Enough.
Some of it was bad, but and it was interesting that you saw Sony sort of follow suit later on with their amazing Crash Bandicoot ads
ever. Hey there, plumber boy.
Just the best, right?
Yeah.
Standing outside Nintendo headquarters with a bullhorn, beautiful. Like, it was so great. So yeah, it was a really fun time, I think, in video games. And I think because the systems were so different from each other, even though they were both technically just 16-bit cartridge systems, it was just a really fun time to be part of it.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that happened in this era that was pretty that still affects us today is a little game called Mortal Kombat came out and really upset a lot of people that don't like video games or don't play video games, and the ESRB formed. I'm wondering, since you were a teenager in this era, and you are a Genesis kid, which was the console that had all the blood, not the sweat. I'm wondering if the ESRB kind of affected you in any way, or anyone you know, in terms of the ability for you to walk into a store and buy a game, or for your parents to I know some of my friends, like my best friend, his parents almost made him return Gears of War when they saw what that game actually was like when I was a teenager. So I'm just curious if that had any impact that you felt when that came out, or was that more of a kind of just for like show to get the parents off their backs?
I think it was absolutely for show. I mean, it's, nowadays the rating system is used and paid more attention to, I think, in general. And I think that really started in the sort of the turn of the century. God, I can't believe I said it that way. The early 2000s. I mean, the rating system was a thing. You got to remember too that before there was the ESRB, Sega had its own rating system. They actually started rating games voluntarily on the Genesis, and I think Mortal Kombat was one of the first ones. But yeah, it didn't really affect us. Plus, I was in my like mid to late teens at that point, so I didn't really know anybody, and I was working in game rental stores at that point as well. And we were never given a directive to be like, you can't rent an M-rated game to a kid. But I mean, there weren't that many of them either. It's not like it is today, right? You back then you had like Doom was starting to hit consoles, and if you were on like the 32X, it looked like Doom, whereas Nintendo's big thing was always changing the blood to a different color, and somehow that wasn't gory or violent. And it's, it seemed to serve them well. Or things like Lethal Enforcers, which is also another one of those games that was part of the congressional hearings that sort of resulted in the ESRB. And, like, I think the only real difference was on the Super Nintendo, when you shot somebody, and it was all digitized graphics, so they were pictures of real people. I think they didn't even react. I think they just blinked off the screen. Whereas on like the Genesis, they would like reel back for a frame, and I think maybe the shot would be blood red or something like that. So, it was pretty tame. It was really tame compared to today. Even Mortal Kombat, when you look at it, was pretty tame compared to what you would see in an M-rated game nowadays, right? I mean, it was gory, but it was so cartoonishly gory that, I do remember a lot of the news coverage around it. And I actually ended up being one of a kid that was on, if anyone remembers, Canadians might remember the show called Street Sense.
Yep. I think I've seen that.
They used to record that in Halifax, and they had a bunch of kids on to talk about violent video games. So I was actually on CBC talking about Mortal Kombat, but I was like 17 at the time, so it didn't really affect me so much. And my parents weren't paying attention at that point.
Dig up that VOD somewhere.
I'd love to. You can't find Street Sense online anywhere.
We'll ask Justin.
Yeah,
he'll find it somewhere.
There you go.
Yeah,
he's probably on it too.
Yeah, it's interesting because like you had mentioned Lethal Enforcers. I watched like not the whole thing because it's probably pretty boring, but I seen clips of the court hearing, and he actually had like the pink gun. He cut it off, like he ruined a cabinet to get that. And I thought that was pretty funny. But I also thought it was kind of funny how they chose those games. Because sure, like I guess like there's like you could rip someone's spine out in Mortal Kombat, but I mean that's pretty cartoony. And Lethal Enforcers, it is digitized humans you're shooting, but again, doesn't look very realistic. Whereas before Nintendo and Sega, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Nintendo and Sega both licensed, or maybe not licensed might not be the right word, but they kind of like oversaw like what was being released for their consoles. Whereas Atari didn't as much. And you could like literally go into a video rental store, go in the room with the beads on it, the adult room, and rent like porn video games.
Beat 'em
for
and eat 'em.
Atari. Yeah, which is like I think it's a lot worse than Mortal Kombat, but no one cared about that for some reason. It's just when they started making money and being popular, then
I think one of the things too to remember, which is really important, and I know we're going back to the previous quarter here, but the earliest video game systems weren't necessarily marketed as toys. Like, and you look at like, if you read about the history of like Pong and everything, like one of the reasons that Pong was so popular, it's said, is because like you could be out on a date and the two of you could play it. And you know what I mean? So arcades weren't necessarily just for kids, and video games weren't necessarily just for kids. They were more marketed towards older people, adults and teenagers and that sort of thing. And, like arcades were sort of dens of teenagers for the longest time in the 80s as well. They weren't really very kid friendly anyway. That's where you go to play like a game of Centipede and buy some pot. Like that was where you went, was an arcade. But like that was one of the things that Nintendo did to bring back video games, was to start marketing this thing not as a video game console but as a toy, because retailers didn't want anything to do with video games when Nintendo came back. So it was all about marketing as a toy and sort of following and setting up your sales and distribution like you would for a toy, not a video game system. Really? Not electronics. So I mean, they were kind of Nintendo and Sega, when it came to that, and the revived video game market as a whole, I think were kind of victims of their own success there, where they realized, once Nintendo did it right and everybody hopped on and they were making games for this thing, and then Sega came in and did the same thing. I mean, Sega definitely marketed to an older group, but they were still aiming at teenagers and tweens, or old, like 9 and 10-year-olds who wanted to be teenagers, who wanted
edgy.
who wanted to like the same thing their big brother liked. You know what I mean? So I think that's what led to it. Whereas porn games, I'm sure there was a lot of pearl clutching when those games came out on the Atari, if you even knew that they came out on the Atari.
Right.
But it wasn't the same thing as if something like that had been released on a Genesis or a Super Nintendo in the mainstream in like the early 90s. I think it would have been a much bigger fervor. Plus, I think you also have to remember that this is in the same era where they were putting parental advisory stickers on rap albums and stuff like that too. I mean, video games didn't live in a vacuum. It was sort of, everybody was pushing the envelope a little bit in a lot of the different arts and media, and a lot of parents groups were pushing back at that point in like a national way. Like the whole parental advisory thing wasn't that like Tipper Gore, I think, was sort of the head of that group, and Al Gore was the vice president, I think, at the time, or was about to be the vice president at the time. So that was all happening in the 90s as well. It was definitely a different time. And you were also, like, if you go back and look at porn games like Custer's Revenge on the 2600,
that's the one I'm aware of.
Yeah, it's laughable. The content isn't, but the graphics are. I mean, it doesn't look real.
No,
right? Whereas you look at Night Trap,
looks better than ET, though.
It does look better than ET. But you look at like Night Trap, and you're talking about real actors and actresses. So, or Mortal Kombat, for as cartoonishly gory as it was, I mean, those were digitized characters. So I see why it became more of a thing in the 90s, but it was still, it was overblown, but I don't think it was either. I think that, it had to happen. The industry wanted to grow up, and part of growing up meant they needed to police themselves a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And, the ESRB made sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think the ESRB serves a really good purpose, especially for parents that are buying games for kids and they don't necessarily know like what's going on. But it's interesting that you, like, taking it back a couple steps. I never really looked at through that lens where you had mentioned that video games originally were marketed towards like teenagers or adults, like more as electronics versus toys. And that's part of what may have led to the crash, so to speak, and that Nintendo marketed as a toy and whatnot, because I always thought that they were marketed as toys. And one of the things that happened later on, like mostly in the late 90s and onwards, is they started to market games more so to adults, like games like Metal Gear Solid, games like Doom, or like Final Fantasy even became more mature with 7 versus some of the other ones, stuff like that. So it sounds like it was kind of like both are true.
Yeah, and I think honestly the ESRB played a big part of that in the 90s. Not that Metal Gear Solid and things like that wouldn't exist, but I think it opened the door and made it safer to release games that were a little bit more adult aiming. And I'm not just talking about porn, although that was a thing too, but it's just like, we can push the envelope a little bit more, because we're self-policing, and we've got this sort of shield around us now, where it's like, if somebody makes a big deal out of it, you can point at it and say, well, it's got an M on it. It says right there on the package that you should be 17 or older to play this. Whereas if that didn't exist, you still had this sort of kid-friendly Nintendo. So if it just had a Nintendo logo on it, there was an assumption it was for a kid, or even a Sega logo, So I think it totally opened the door and allowed things for, especially on the console side. PC, not so much, because PCs were always marketed towards adults. But for the consoles, it's like, Doom can exist now, and Mortal Kombat can exist now, and Metal Gear Solid can exist in that form now. We can do this stuff now because we're all grown up.
Mm-hmm. And one question that I like, taking it back right to the beginning of this quarter, that I forgot to bring up is, you had said that pretty much right at the onset you were like Team CD, because I know that was kind of a point of contention with some people. My experience with it was CD was kind of I wasn't a huge fan of it until the PlayStation. And even when it came out on PlayStation, there were some significant advantages to cartridges, specifically like loading times. So I'm wondering, like, was there anything specific, like maybe a specific game or a specific experience that made you like want to be an early adopter of disc-based media?
You're gonna laugh at me. I was really excited about full motion video games. That felt like the future to me, and I didn't think that was going to necessarily take over what video games were, but it felt so cutting edge. And like I mean, we've really only talked about the first half of the 90s here so far, but that's one of the things about the 90s that I really love, is that multimedia started to sort of merge with video games. And the best part about that was that nobody knew what to do with that for the first little while. And you ended up with having these really sort of diverse, interesting, off the wall, and a lot of times terrible, different video games, based on, like, well, what do we do with CD? Redbook Audio. Redbook Audio was great. Redbook Audio coming to video games was a huge thing, right? Like, everything, well, not everything, but everything could sound so much better. So that was one of the things that I loved. Like sort of animate, not necessarily full motion video, but just sort of animated cutscenes and having so much space. I mean, if you go back and you look at a lot of old NES games, like I mentioned as well, like Genesis, Altered Beast took me 20 minutes to play through the first time. And if you look at a lot of cartridge games, a lot of action games from that era, they're not very long, because memory space was still an issue, right? Memory was still expensive. And in the late 80s, early 90s, I remember there was like this huge shortage for chips and things like that in the Nintendo cartridges, which was why things like Super Mario Brothers 3 were so hard to get for a while. Whereas like CDs, you had these little discs, they didn't cost anything to make, and you didn't have to deal with things like chip shortages and cost of memory, that you had a ton of memory. So there was that. But then it also opened the door for things like full motion video. And, full motion video wasn't a new thing in the 90s. I mean, in the early 80s, we were playing Dragon's Lair in the arcades. So suddenly that could come home. That sort of thing could come home, for better or worse, right? I thought it was really interesting. I thought there was something there. I was full on board with Sewer Shark and Night Trap and Road Avenger and stuff. Some of those are still my favorite games, mostly for the nostalgia. But it was really fun to watch. And then as the decade moved on, you had like Pioneer deciding to bring out a Laserdisc based game console, and you had Trip Hawkins leaving Electronic Arts to create 3DO. And that was sort of the going again and saying, hey, this crowd that were kids when we started bringing video games back are now getting older. They've got more disposable income. They're high tech. They want something more high tech to go in with their stereo systems and their, not HD TVs, but big screen televisions. And so let's do 3DO, and Philips with CDI, and Atari with Jaguar. Like, it just, you look at the middle of the 90s and there's a ridiculous number of consoles out there, and they're all trying to do something different. Most of them failed, but it was sort of a really exciting time to see what people were going to do. So that's why I was on board with it. It was like, it felt like the next step. And I threw my weight behind Sega, because while the TurboGrafx CD was out there, the TurboGrafx 16 came out and failed pretty quickly in North America. So, I was like, it's going to be either Sega or Nintendo. Sega went with it, so I went with Sega, and yeah, went with that, and ended up buying my system from Florida, and it didn't even work when I got it.
Oh, really? Was it like a region thing, or just bad luck?
No, it was bad luck. So one of the things that came out, or that I learned, is like, being in Canada, sometimes bigger items didn't ship here. You had to wait a long time for them. And I really, really, really wanted a Sega CD. I'd saved my money and I wanted one as soon as it came out. And my aunt happened to be traveling to Florida. So I gave her my money and said, like, can you buy me a Sega CD and send it back? Yep, no problem. She shipped it back, and it got here. I plugged it all in. I turned it on, and nothing happened. And if you look at Sega CD boxes from the original run, you'll see little arrows that say this side up. Apparently turning those things over was not good for them. So if it got turned over in shipping, it might not work. I don't know what I don't know why, but that was a thing. So I ended up having to go to a local game shop, and it was the place that I was renting a lot of my Genesis games from, and I knew they were selling Sega CDs, and they happened to have some at the time. And I walked in and said, like, I didn't buy this here. Is there anything I can do with this? And the guy behind the counter, who was actually, we've been friends ever since, he couldn't do anything about it, but the owner happened to walk in at the exact same time and asked what was going on. And he's just like, well, Greg here has this. He got it shipped from Florida. It doesn't work. He's trying to see what he can do about it. And the owner saw that there was a stack of them behind the counter, and he just pointed and said, just give him one of ours. And,
really?
Yeah. So it's pretty cool. And then I
good
came home
customer
and played my
service.
Sega CD. So
It's too bad Yelp wasn't around back then. Could have gave him a
no kidding.
5-star review.
Right.
Yeah, I know that cartridges was kind of part of the business model too. I know for sure with Nintendo, I'm assuming it was probably the same with Sega, where they manufactured the carts, right? And then the publishers of the video games had to purchase them from Nintendo. So there was profit to be made by selling the carts, which is why Nintendo was so reluctant to flip to discs, because they didn't have the license for discs in the sense that they were not charging people to make discs exactly.
Right.
And that might be, I could be wrong, but that might be why the GameCube discs were like special discs or whatnot. I'm
guessing so.
Sure.
Yeah.
But it cost them dearly because, and leading into what you're talking about games being short and you wanted bigger experience and stuff like that, game makers also wanted to make bigger games and have these huge experiences and tell these long stories and be able to flush out these characters. And so the long-term partner of Nintendo, the thing that you had alluded to earlier as being kind of the publisher of games that was kind of out of reach for Sega fans that you're happy that your friend had Nintendo for, Square Enix or Enix or both. I don't know if they were combined at this point, but they left Nintendo because they wanted to make games like Final Fantasy VII where they could put these really cool characters, really nice graphics, and fit it all into, I think it still was like 2 discs, maybe, I can't remember, but
I think it's 3.
3, yeah. But they could do that because of discs. So we spent a lot of time, like you said, talking about the first half of the 90s. Getting into the second half of the 90s, this is when I became a mega fan of video games, and there's some really amazing titles that had come out there. So I'm wondering, did you get a PlayStation at launch, or
I got a Saturn?
And do you regret that at all?
No, Saturn is one of my favorite consoles of all
Really?
time. Oh my God. I love the Saturn. So a little bit of context there. I mean, again, I was a Sega guy. I loved the Saturn. I love Sega's arcade games. I become a huge fan. The fact that Daytona was coming out, Daytona looked terrible, but the fact that it was coming out on the Saturn, Virtua Fighter on the Saturn, that was a big deal to me. Plus, I just, I loved a lot of their franchises. I was assuming there would be a new Sonic on the Saturn, which never really happened. I was assuming there would be a new Eternal Champions on the Saturn, which never really happened, or a new Streets of Rage, which never happened. So,
there's no Sonic on the Sega Saturn?
Nope, there was no Sonic. Pretty famously, there was one in development that never came out called Sonic Extreme. It was just so bad that they never finished it.
Wow.
But anyway, yeah, I went full on the Saturn. So I didn't buy a PlayStation right away. I did eventually buy one when Formula One came out. Actually, the game Formula One from Psygnosis is the reason I bought a PlayStation. Super glad that I did, though, because the PlayStation ended up being a great console. But see, back then you have to remember too, Sony, if you were a video game fan before now, they didn't have a great reputation in video games. Like they released games under the Sony ImageSoft name. Their games usually sucked.
I don't know about this. What I only know Sony in terms of video games as they made the audio chip for Super Nintendo, and they got totally screwed by Nintendo, and then they made PlayStation. The rest is history. That's all I know. I know they published games before PlayStation. Okay.
Yep. You look them up in Sony ImageSoft. So they released a lot of terrible sports games. They released a fair amount of middling to good movie, like the game Hook, based on the movie Hook, was
for Super
okay.
Nintendo?
Yep, that was Sony ImageSoft.
That was Sony.
Mm-hmm.
I had that game.
Actually,
it was really hard.
What's his name? Oh God, who created Twisted Metal and God of War?
David Jaffe.
David Jaffe. His first job, I think, his first game job was Sony ImageSoft.
Cool.
They released a Disney game called Mickey Mania, which was actually one of the best games they released.
Is that the one where it starts out in black and white?
Yep, that's the one.
Oh my god, that game was awesome, right? And I got it from like for some reason, like Easter or Christmas, or some present. I got it. Anyways, a kid in my neighborhood stole it. I beat the black and white part, and then I went out to play, and then we came inside to play or whatever, and he stole it, and I never got to play it again, and I could never find it anywhere. Like they never like re-released it or
really?
Because I had a Super Nintendo like late, and I actually got a PS1 like between when I got a Super Nintendo and then got a PS1. That was like the fastest I ever like was able to upgrade to another console just because of how it worked out with when I got it and whatnot. So I always remember thinking that black and white level was awesome. Yep. And I never got to finish that game, and it's burnt into my mind, and I have never been able to find it or another way to play it.
The premise of that game was great. It was so brilliant, and it made so much sense. It's like, hey, let's just pick a bunch of classic Mickey Mouse shorts and build levels out of them. But yeah, that was David Jaffe.
You probably have a copy of it, I'm guessing.
Oh God, yeah. Well, I have the superior Sega CD version.
Oh, really? Okay.
Little System Wars there for you. But yeah, so Sega was proven, N64 was off in the distance, and Sony was Sony, and Sony did not have a great reputation when it came to video games. So I made my choice for the Saturn, and I don't regret it. And one of the things that I've really loved in recent years is the Saturn did so badly. It did so poorly, especially here. And a lot of people didn't experience the library, but in recent years, it feels like people are starting to discover these games that I loved in the late 90s. So it's so much fun to see people either play those games for the first time, or like I stream 3 nights a week. And if I stream a Saturn game that I loved, like last year I was streaming this game called Dragon Force from Working Designs, which is this great sort of strategy RPG. And everybody who was watching my stream was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, this is a great game. I didn't even know this existed. So it's like seeing people react to that stuff. The Saturn had a wonderful library, and it was weird. All of my friends had Saturns.
Really?
So we were all about it. If you liked, especially if you liked arcade, like if you liked Sega fighting games, and Sega was making some amazing 3D fighting games in the 90s, like Last Bronx and Fighters Mega Mix and Virtua Fighter and like Fighters. I already said Fighters. Fighting Vipers is the other one. Like the arcade ports of those on the Saturn were fantastic. Sega made great games on the Saturn. Everyone else struggled to make good games on the Saturn because of the architecture, right? So yeah, the late 90s, a lot of the late 90s for me was spent as a Saturn lover who unfortunately saw the whole world playing PlayStation instead. And I did eventually end up buying a PlayStation because of that. You couldn't not. I mean, that was the system down in the late 90s. You had to. If you wanted to play the best games, you had to have a PlayStation.
That's really interesting. Well, first of all, I literally have never played a Saturn. I'm not even like 100% confident that I've seen one in real life, but I can relate to that so much because that to me like sounds like exactly, well, maybe not exactly, a little role reversal there, but it has a lot of parallels with me flipping to getting an Xbox and all of my friends getting an Xbox, but the whole world getting a PS2 and finding these gems. Cause I can name a bunch of Xbox games that, I mean, you definitely would have heard of them, but most people wouldn't. Like I thought Tau Fang Fist of Lotus was amazing. It's one of my favorite fighting games. The actual damage that you can see on your characters is awesome. Stuff like Bloodwake, stuff like Obscure, which might have been a multi-platform game. I'm not sure, but
I don't remember that one.
Well, it's pretty obscure, huh? Run Like Hell. I think that was actually multi-platform too. But yeah, there's Breakdown was it's still one of the best games ever. But like most people don't know those because they just weren't popular. And there's all these like hidden gems. It was like the hidden gem console of that era, I think. And it sounds like Saturn might be filling that role for that gen. So I know how you feel, and I definitely respect that decision.
Yeah.
Was there any games in particular that you could say was like the best game on Saturn or like your favorite? Oh my gosh.
Game? I tried to do this today actually, and my list is so long. But yeah, I mean, there were a few things that stood out. Like the Panzer Dragoon series was amazing on the
Did that
Saturn.
start on Saturn?
Yep, Panzer Dragoon
Okay.
was a launch game on the Saturn in North America.
Panzer Dragoon Ortas, another hidden gem on Xbox.
There you go. Yeah. There was a series of first-person shooters that were fantastic on the Saturn, done by a company called Lobotomy, that I think was bought pretty quickly after that and was, I think, stuck making like casino games after a while. But they released a game called Powerslay, which is actually getting a re-release very soon. It was a great first person shooter, and it was really, really, really well done on the Saturn. And Sega ended up contracting them to do Quake and Duke Nukem on the Saturn, which were both fantastic ports of those games for a system that wasn't supposed to be able to do 3D very well. They're amazing. Any Sega stuff, like Sega Rally is one of my favorite all-time games on the Saturn and on just in general in video games. Virtua Fighter 2 is still incredible. Fighters Megamix is still incredible. You had Working Designs releasing Dragon Force was a huge thing. I could go on and on about Saturn. I mean, it had great shooters, had great 2D fighters. Like that was the only system to play if you wanted to play like Night Warriors or Street Fighter or X-Men. You know, like they were always better on the Saturn.
It didn't have an analog stick on the controller, right?
It did eventually.
It did?
When the game Knights came out. Only with them, it was kind of like a disc. It wasn't really it was a stick, but it wasn't. But yeah, it was released for the game Knights.
I need to watch some Saturn documentaries. That's like a black spot in my video game.
See, that's what I'm talking about. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And then people pick it up and like, wow, there's some really good stuff here. It's not all great, but the good stuff is really good.
Yeah. So before we wrap this quarter, you did mention that you got a PlayStation. That's a pretty significant console for me, pretty significant console for a lot of people. I'm wondering if you have any fond memories of that, any things that stand out, any games that stand out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the PlayStation, like I said, I was a latecomer to that, but like a few of the things that really stand out, and I've listened to your other episodes, so you're going to love when I say this, but Metal Gear Solid is like right at the top of the list. That game was incredible. The most cinematic thing ever. And I was a fan of the original. Well, I shouldn't say that. The port to the NES, which was not the same as the original MSX game, but I was a big fan of Metal Gear Solid or Metal Gear. So when Metal Gear Solid came out, I was all over. I imported the special edition and everything. I was really into it. Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I was a huge Super Metroid fan on the Super Nintendo. So Symphony of the Night is one of my all-time favorite games as well. And Gran Turismo is another one for me, being a big racing game fan. And you mentioned analog stick on the Saturn. When that came out, along with the analog controller for the PlayStation, it changed racing games on consoles. I mean, you know, people cringe when you call it a simulator because compared to like the best PC simulators, it doesn't really hold up. But when you consider what they were trying to do with Gran Turismo and how it was a bunch of real cars that all felt different, whether they felt realistic is up for debate. And then you combined it with the dual analog stick that Sony brought out. This was before the DualShock. It just played like nothing else. And I have super fond memories of that too, because the 90s was also the first time I ever went to E3. And I remember driving down to Atlanta for E3 97, which was the year that Gran Turismo was being released here. I believe it was 97. And Sony was running a contest for setting a fast lap at Trial Mountain. And whoever set the fastest lap at the show would win a trip for two to see a sports car race at Laguna Seca in California. And I ended up winning that.
Really?
So, yeah. Which in the next quarter is actually the basis for a good story. I hope I remember to tell it when we get there. But
I won't forget.
But yeah, I absolutely. And the only reason is because I was I was really, really active online at that point and on chat program called IRC, where I was chatting with a bunch of magazine editors, mostly from Ziff Davis. That's where I met a lot of those people. And there was a guy on there named Marty Chin who would sell imports, and he had sort of hipped us all to Gran Turismo coming out, and I was so enamored by it that I imported the Japanese version along with the controller. So by the time I got to E3 that year, I was a master at the game.
That's so greasy. You cheated.
Yeah, I absolutely did. Kind of. So,
Whatever. Win's a win.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah. And the other thing about, I think, PlayStation that stands out for me that I think a lot of people don't really consider is that it was the home to some great non-Square RPGs as well. Konami in particular was releasing some really good RPGs on that system early on. And so was Sony, like Wild Arms and Suikoden and Vandal Hearts and things like that. So they definitely stand out as well.
Now, you said you had went to E3, and we'll probably talk more about this in the next quarter, but was that as a fan or was that part of work?
That was as part of not work, but as part of a website that I had started, which was sort of the beginning of my career in games journalism. Through IRC and things like that, I had hooked up with some like-minded folks who, again, some of them were already magazine editors, but there was one in particular named Sam Kennedy, which is a name that some people will know, who had a website called Gaming Enthusiast Online. And I joined up there, and he was having trouble with his publisher at the time. So a group of us broke off and decided to form a website called Gaming Age, which is where NeoGAF came from ultimately. But that was what I was there for. We would go down to E3 on our own dime, on press passes from Gaming Age, and cover the show. It was great. I loved it. It was a great time.
Cool. Yeah, that's been a dream of mine to always go to E3, although it's not quite the same anymore, especially since a little pandemic happened. But yeah, maybe one day I'll get there. Maybe I'll win a trip somewhere. But that will bring us to the end of quarter 2. Moving right along to quarter number 3, we're going to be looking at the year 2000, the millennium, to 2009. But before we do, let's put a coin into the arcade time machine and take a look at what gaming was like in that era.
One of the most eagerly awaited video games finally goes on sale.
Preparing to rewrite retail history.
Video game is expected to have bigger first-day revenues than any movie has ever had an opening day at the box office.
The latest video game war is heating up tonight. Nintendo's GameCube system is about to hit the stores.
Far from the Mushroom Kingdom, among a people enchanted by sunshine, Mario has taken a break from the hopping, the bopping, and saving the princess.
All to fulfill his destiny, which is, above all else, to save me.
The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker.
Good afternoon, I'm Donna Gregory. And I'm Heidi Deja. There are waiting lists and tickets just to stand in line and get a chance to buy PlayStation 2.
A story of one man's struggle to save mankind from extermination and his quest to win the heart of the woman he loves.
And a new myth will be written in the blood of the old. God of War, rated M for mature.
Just like the Xbox, it is truly the future of video games, and I'm very excited to simply be a part of it if you smell what The Rock is cooking.
I just got into Xbox Live. I have this really great high-speed connection, and
I need a weapon.
There are those who said this day would never come. What are they to say now?
Rated M for mature.
As one warrior falls, two shall take its place, as is the creed of the console wars. As Sega is laid to rest, Sony and Microsoft join the fight, bringing forth the era of the most influential game since Mario, changing people's perspectives in more ways than one, while also taking gaming to a new frontier, broadband internet. Tell me, Greg, in this era of your gaming life, what devices did you game on? What was your favorite? And do you remember how you got them?
Yeah, in this era was when I started in 2000. I was working at EGM at this point, Electronic Gaming Monthly. So I was playing on pretty much everything. I was still sort of basking in the glow of the Dreamcast. I loved the Dreamcast, but not like I did the Saturn. I really liked that system. It was great. I think it was ahead of its time. I remember when the PlayStation 2 came out, noting how in a lot of ways Dreamcast games looked better, especially as far as texture quality went. And of course, while it wasn't broadband, you could play your Dreamcast online out of the box, which was huge, putting in that 56K modem. It sounds laughable to say that now, but 56K. And me and one of the other EGM editors, Chris Johnston, who I actually do my podcast with, spent endless nights playing a game called Speed Devils Online Racing with people online. It's still one of my fondest memories. But I will have to say, probably, at least for the first part of this era, I would have to say PlayStation 2 is my favorite memory, my favorite system there, just because it was so popular and so ubiquitous that by the end of its life, you were getting a lot of really oddball titles that I don't think would have normally made their way to North America. Along with, of course, and I think Xbox has a lot to do with this too, a lot more American games happening, American developed games happening on consoles that I think weren't before. But I was a big PlayStation 2 fan, big Xbox fan. GameCube, I liked a few games. I was looking at my collection tonight, and it's probably one of the smallest collections I have is GameCube, whereas PlayStation 2 and Xbox are two of the biggest collections I have. So, yeah, I was definitely a PlayStation 2 fan and loved having the Xbox for the system exclusives. That was the big thing. I was a big fan of the system exclusives on the Xbox.
So you didn't really like, it might be overblown because this is like me when I had the Xbox. This is like my prime, like scummy console war era where I had no shame and there was no Twitter or anything like that. But I would like rip on kids at school that had PS2s because the Xbox games ran better. They did
look better.
They did look better, but that didn't matter to you.
No, not really. I mean, but you got to remember, so like you're talking about how this was your prime sort of console war days.
I was at my most cringiest.
For me, at least the first half of the 2000s, I wasn't even paying for my video games.
Okay.
So, I was getting them. I was playing as part of my job. I was playing them and getting a lot of them for free as press. So it was a little bit different, although I did buy my PlayStation 2. I'm one of the people who actually stayed outside of Best Buy overnight in Chicago in the freezing cold to buy my PlayStation 2. But as far as my Xbox and I think my GameCube, we got those from Microsoft and Nintendo.
Okay.
So when you don't pay for things, it's definitely different.
Yeah.
The
don't have as much
wars
of
thing doesn't really take hold so much.
You don't have to justify your purchase by tribal warfare. Yeah,
exactly.
So what are some of these PS2 games that really stand out to you? Because I keep in mind, I am so biased. Like this, my opinion is so irrelevant here. But I actually had a conversation about this with my friend Mo from the Backlog Chronicles podcast. And he had said, like, I was talking about how I love the Xbox games library, kind of similar conversation we had a few minutes ago. And he was saying, but the PS2 library was so good. And I was like, okay, well, let's go game for game. We'll name games that are really good. And like, he couldn't think of any because there's people have always say that the PS2 library is like huge and awesome and great. And it's one of the best libraries of all time. It's definitely the biggest library, I think, of all time. That might actually be that might be an actual fact. Yeah. But I'm not, and again, for anyone listening that's not an Xbox fan and a PlayStation fan, I am so biased when it comes to this area that do not take what I'm saying seriously at all. But I think that the Xbox had a massively better library. So I'm really curious to what games, like I'm talking about games that you couldn't have played on Xbox.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to go through and figure that out exactly. But I guess to begin with, anything that came from Sony itself, obviously, because the PlayStation 2 is where Jak and Daxter was a thing. Ratchet and Clank, that series started there. Sly Cooper, that series started on there. There was a lot of stuff too, I find, on that system that it might have come out later on the Xbox, but like it kind of came out first. So when it was hot and when I was really into it, as an example, the Grand Theft Auto games, 3 and Vice City, I think in particular, those two came out first on that system. Same with like the Devil May Cry games. Dragon Quest 8 came out on that system. Final Fantasies were all on the PlayStation 2 as well. So, God of War, Gran Turismo, which was hugely important to me. Gran Turismo 3 was a revelation when it came out. So, there were a ton of great games on that system that you couldn't get on the Xbox, which is why I always kind of looked at it from the standpoint of, actually, I thought it was worth owning all three. Because I wanted my PlayStation 2 for the things I couldn't play on Xbox. I wanted my Xbox for things I couldn't play on PlayStation 2. And I wanted a GameCube for Nintendo games. I didn't care about much else. Right. So, you still had, I think the easiest way to put it is you had more Japanese game support on the PlayStation 2 that you didn't get on the Xbox. If that wasn't important to you, then it didn't matter. You know what I mean?
It wasn't, but I think it wasn't because I was a console warrior where like, I don't want to play these. I can't play. I really do want to play them, but I just can't play them. So I'm going to pretend like I hate Japanese RPGs, which I definitely did. Cause again, I'm like 13, 14, 15. I'm a like degenerate. Right. So I'm definitely more evolved now. Like I still don't actually play a lot of JRPGs, but I have all three and I'm retired. I'm a retired console warrior, but, one question I had is, correct me if I'm wrong, you said you had started at EGM in 2000, and before that you did work in games media, but it was like an indie kind of site that you had created. So, and I could be like off base here, but when the Xbox came out, and maybe the GameCube, I can't actually remember what year that came out, but those two consoles would have been like announced and gone through like the preview cycle and the release cycle and been really fresh, all while you were covering them and in the industry and perhaps like getting early access or getting like demos of things before these consoles came out. Whereas every single console that you would have played before then, you would have been on the other end of the spectrum, just like absorbing all of the hype and then hoping to get one, maybe getting one at launch. So I'm curious how that kind of may have changed how excited you were for these consoles, or if that affected like how much you liked those consoles that you didn't have to buy, that you had to work on and cover as a job and whatnot.
Sure. Yeah. So and now that you're saying that, I think it was probably 2001 that I started at EGM. I started at Ziff Davis, which was the publisher, in 1999, working on Expert Gamer, which was like a tips and tricks magazine. And then I shifted over to EGM, I think 2001, because I was still at Expert Gamer when the PlayStation 2 came out in Japan, but I was at EGM when it came out in the US. So it was right in that 2001 era. And I believe GameCube and Xbox came out in 2002, maybe.
2001 for Xbox for sure. I don't know about GameCube. It was November 15th, 2001 for Xbox. Then. I thought PlayStation was 2000, but that might just be
maybe
Japanese.
I have that. I mean, you know what? I must have that wrong. Yeah, I must be off by a year on everything. So yeah, but you're absolutely right. So the Xbox and the GameCube were systems that came out while I was in the gaming press, like from start to finish. And it was interesting. For me, the biggest difference was, outside of, again, not necessarily paying for these consoles, was access to the Japanese versions of them. I had previously imported a Dreamcast. I was super excited about the Dreamcast and had actually imported one in 1998. That was the first time I'd ever done that. But again, you're kind of at the mercy of what the games press is telling you, as opposed to what they know at that point. So for me, the big thing was sort of being completely ensconced in all the news surrounding all this stuff. I mean, we did a worldwide reveal of the Xbox previous to it coming out. I wasn't the one who went to Redmond to cover that, but I was one of the people who was working at the magazine at the time. So, as far as copy editing and things go. So, and the people who did go there came back and they were talking about it nonstop. So like you're sort of really neck deep in information, and it's part of your daily job to know it and to be part of it and to be absorbing it. So as a fan, I would do that based on what the different magazines were saying. But as an editor, you kind of couldn't get away from it. And it was kind of great, especially for an early 20-something video game nerd who kind of your whole life revolved around that anyway, to be completely on the inside and in the know for all that sort of thing. As far as the first time playing them, it was amazing actually, because we did a launch issue for the Xbox and the GameCube. It was actually one issue because they both came out at the exact same time, or I think within days of one another. And so because of magazine lead times, if we were going to cover them, we had to play them months before they came out. And so we actually talked Microsoft and Nintendo, who were both on the West Coast, to actually both in Washington at the time, to bring consoles to our offices in Chicago for like 2 or 3 days. And we literally just had this 2 or 3 day stretch where all of us editors did nothing but play GameCube and Xbox games months before they came out, which was amazing. Actually, I should say weeks before they came out. It was actually very, very soon after 9/11. For weirdly enough, I remember that. But yeah, so like I vividly remember us. I remember Microsoft showing up with this gigantic like steamer trunks, because the Xbox was a huge console. You know,
all that power,
and like setting them up and us hooking them up to the office LAN to play Halo. To play 16 players, I think was the highest you could play. 16-player Halo. And it was all just a bunch of tables. And the magazine actually has a picture of that issue. A bunch of tables with we had little Sony Trinitron televisions in our cubicles usually. And they were set up with an Xbox next to each of them. And just a huge crowd of Ziff Davis employees and editors sitting there playing Halo. Again, weeks before it came out, which was amazing. And then at the same time, at the other end of the building, we had Nintendo there with GameCubes. And we actually learned during that situation that Rogue Leader was reviewable. The copy that they brought with them was reviewable. So we actually sat there all night, the first night, and played through until we rolled credits on Rogue Leader so that we could review the game in the upcoming issue as well. And I mean, that looked amazing too. I loved Luigi's Mansion as well. So, you know, it's like, it was just this, it was so weird. It was like being at a theme park or something. It was like the coolest thing in the world. You couldn't believe you got paid to do this. And then like a month later, Microsoft in particular was like, oh, and here's 15 Xboxes. Hand them out to your editors. You know, let them take them home. That they belong to them. And even things like when Live came out, they sent us all the headsets. You remember the headsets that came with Live? They sent us all headsets, but they had our names, our gamer tags written on them.
Really?
Yeah. It was really neat.
Cool.
Microsoft was amazing when they brought out the Xbox. That team was incredible. They were in it to win it. They were so media friendly. They were so developer friendly. It was awesome. It was a great time.
Yeah, I can only imagine. One thing I heard you say there is you said there was a copy of Rogue Leader that was like quote reviewable. Did they send you like copies that were like maybe specific for a preview that weren't, that you couldn't like do certain things, or you couldn't score? Because like obviously back then you're not getting like Steam codes or anything like that. Right. So is that how the process, I don't know if you're even, this is like top secret or whatever, but is that how the process worked? Is they would send you like an early build on a disc and you would play it on like a dev console or something like that to write a preview, for example?
For the most part, you would. Now in that situation, obviously there were no, they were usually test consoles, not dev consoles. There were none for either of those systems. And different companies did different things. Like when we had preview discs on like a Dreamcast, you had what was called a key disc. And you would load that up first and then swap it out for whatever the build was. For like PlayStation 2, you had test kits. So if you got early builds, they would only run on a test kit. But yeah, that was normally how it worked. The build would show up and it would say whether it was reviewable or not. And then you would go from there. Now with Nintendo, it worked differently. Nintendo was very, very high security. So like in a situation, as an example, if say Final Fantasy X came out, we would get a review build. Usually a Squaresoft game would come with caveats with like, you know, don't show any screenshots of this. You know, like that was part of the NDA that you would sign, and don't talk about this element of the story, because they just didn't want you to give away the plot in any of your coverage. But that was it. Otherwise, you sort of, you know, were on your own. If you wanted to take a test kit home so that you could play it to review it, you could do that. It didn't have to stay in the building. You were trusted that you weren't going to leak it or anything like that. And back then it was harder to do stuff like that anyway, because the internet wasn't, you know, broadband internet wasn't really a thing. For for Nintendo, as an example, I remember reviewing Paper Mario on the N64, and the way that worked is a Nintendo rep would show up with an N64 and the cartridge locked in a steel box that had holes for the controller ports and the power and AV cable, and that was it. The person that was there, the rep, did not have the key to the lockbox. So it had been packaged up in Redmond, sent with them. The rule was they had to be in the room at all times while it was being used. Technically, if they went to the bathroom, they were supposed to unhook everything, put it back in the case, and take it with them. So, like, I remember,
what were they worried about here?
Well, I think it had to do with piracy, and Nintendo was always fighting piracy. And I know that there was a situation, I think, on N64 in particular, where like the N64 version of Resident Evil 2, a review version was leaked, and Capcom, one of the other things that a lot of companies would do is they would sort of, I don't know how, software wise, like stamp where a build went, so they knew where the build had come from, who had leaked it, and that sort of thing. And Nintendo was just all about not letting that ever happen. So, for better or worse, I remember when I reviewed Paper Mario, it was just me and the Nintendo rep in the building at like 2 a.m. because I was still playing, and she had to stick around. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Must have been super comfortable. Like, it was such a great experience.
Yeah, it was different, but I mean, they were still like that with the GameCube. So like, even through all that, although with the Xbox, they weren't super, like, it wasn't a like, don't let it out of my sight kind of thing, but they were always around anyway, because this was a system that wasn't out yet.
Now, I know that, like, specifically, like Halo, for example, like I don't know, I have a lot of Halo facts in my brain, unsurprisingly, but I know that at the E3 before launch specifically, like, the build was like horrible. Like, most people thought the game was trash, and like the Xbox was doomed, and there's no chance that you could turn what they played into something good by November 15th. And I'm wondering if you've ever, well, maybe did you play that build, or B, have you played like a game in an early state that wasn't in great shape, and did that ever affect like your excitement for the final product, or did that like ever skew like how you look at a game that maybe you didn't even check out at launch because of your early impressions that not everybody would be able to get?
I can't think of anything that was in terrible shape. No, first of all, I did not play that build of Halo. The first time I ever played Halo was when they brought it to us for that launch issue, and it was in pretty great shape by that point.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I can't think of a game that was terrible or so terrible in a preview build that it soured me on it. I can think of games that were pretty different in preview builds, like, as an example, Eco on the PlayStation 2. I remember playing a preview build of that, and it was still really good, but it was pretty different from what came out in the final version. I really wish I kept that build, to be honest, because it felt so different. But no, nothing like that really. I mean, we played our fair share of really buggy, broken games, but you kind of understood that was the case. It wasn't necessarily that gameplay was bad so much as, this is software. This is how it's done. This is an alpha build. It's got tons of bugs. It's going to crash after 5 minutes. Like, it is what it is, but it didn't really sour you on the game when it came out.
Cool. And also another big thing that happened in this era was games started connecting. Like, I know that the Dreamcast, you said, had a 56K modem, but we're in the big leagues now in this generation, and we have broadband, DSL, high speed internet, Halo 2, stuff like that, Xbox Live. Now, you were there from the dawn of this, potentially. I think you were probably still in games media at the time,
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing, and so you got to see this coming. I'm just wondering how that affected you. Like, it made a huge change in me. I changed the games I play completely. I went from playing mostly single player to almost only Halo 2 and other multiplayer games.
Yeah, for me it was I remember vividly the first time we played anything on Live as editors, because I think, if you remember Live, I want to say that Microsoft really launched it with their football game. That was kind of the big first Live game.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of them. It was NFL Fever 2003. 2003, I think. There was other, like, Unreal Championship was a big one at launch. Top Spin, I think, was there potentially. I think Project Gotham 2 was a big one.
That was the big one for me. Project Gotham 2 was the big one for me.
Cat and Mouse.
I remember our editors, wasn't me so much, but like our sports editors actually playing a game of Fever with like people in Redmond, people from Microsoft as a demo of what Live could do. Now remember, we're also still, this was better than it was on Dreamcast, but I mean a lot of these people were big Phantasy Star Online players on Dreamcast, and NFL 2K series also had online play that these guys are really taking advantage of. For me though, it was absolutely Project Gotham 2. The fact that you bring that up is perfect, because that was the game for me that I was like, I am really enjoying this, because previously, I mean, 56K, you're still using a phone line, so it wasn't convenient, right? You were taking up your phone line to play online, so you weren't always online. The thing with the Xbox and the thing with like Project Gotham in particular for me was that you're just always online. You're just always connected. And that was the big difference. And that was the thing that amazed me. And I loved, even if I wasn't racing against other people online at that moment, when I finished an event, the first thing that popped up was the online leaderboards. And you could have it filtered to just your friends. Right.
Yep.
And I was like, yes, that is awesome. I love this. Like, and it seems like such a weird thing now because it's so common and maybe not even that important to people anymore. But back then, you know, especially if I had friends who were playing the game at the same time, and I know like I am so much better at this than CJ, or, you know, oh man, Damien has me beat by like 2 seconds on this lap. I got to go back and play that again. So that was huge. Like it was an absolute game changer. And yeah, Microsoft was way ahead of the curve on that. I mean, it took Sony forever to do that on the PlayStation 2. And when they did, they didn't implement it very well. And same with, you know, Nintendo being Nintendo and just doing whatever they wanted, you know, which has always worked for them. They had an online adapter that you could buy if you, especially, I think it was mostly for Phantasy Star Online 3, but I never had one. I never used it, but I loved having connectivity on my Xbox games. Absolutely.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. Speaking of Xbox, another console came out right around this time as well, the Xbox 360. Again, my perception of this whole time and this whole period of time is skewed heavily, but my recollection of this is it went from everybody like thinking Xbox is like this underdog console, PlayStation 2 is a dominant brand, like that is like the one console, Xbox is like number 2 or 3 even in a lot of people's eyes, but it seemed like that, at least in the West, like in North America, that perception like completely uno reversed, and with the 360 coming out, that was the first and to this day probably the only point in time where Microsoft was really kind of leading the charge. I mean, they physically led the charge because they came out first, but also I think that the mind share and the perception of them outside of Red Ring, which was obviously a major problem, I think that kind of, and I could be completely wrong too, because I was a fanboy, but I think that they really kind of changed things. And I'm wondering, being at ground zero when that happened, because I imagine, and this could be also like a complete misunderstanding as well, but I'm assuming that when you got review codes of games, a lot of the times if it was a multi-platform game, you probably got the PlayStation version, unless there was some marketing thing with Microsoft, because the PlayStation is going to have more people have that copy, that more people that buy the magazine are going to have a PlayStation 2. So it makes sense to like write for them, I guess, in some way, even though it kind of works.
Maybe a little bit, but I mean, no, normally you would get whatever was available.
Okay.
So, and I had actually left at this point. I was actually back in Nova Scotia. I was freelancing at the time. But I mean, yeah, let's talk about 360 and the launch for a while. I think you're absolutely right. I think that 360 is a wonderful example of almost perfect marketing for a system launch. Microsoft just did everything right with that launch. And you even mentioned the Red Ring, which should have been a huge disaster. If you remember, Microsoft managed to turn that into a plus somehow. I still don't understand how they did it. But, you know, when it finally became such a big thing that was happening, and then they just started replacing consoles, it was still a pain in the ass. You know, I mean, I went through 3 Xbox 360s. And everyone, I don't know a person who owned a 360 who didn't have a red ring. At least not early on, right?
I didn't.
You never red ringed your 360? Wow.
So when the Halo 3 console came out, the green one with the orange disc tray, I sold my white one to get that one. And like when I like reset the console and turned it on, it red ringed, and I was like, oh my God, I'm about to sell this. So I turned it off, and I just like was like, I didn't see that. That didn't happen. I turned it back on, and it was fine. So then I just sold it. And as far as I know, it didn't red ring. It probably did.
But you know what? But there's a great example. Even if it did, whoever you sold that to was able to call Microsoft and get a replacement. You didn't need to be under warranty. You didn't need to prove where you got it. You know what I mean? Like they handled it right. But I mean, as far as the 360 goes, I think if you were a hardcore, I need Japanese RPGs, the Japanese game support on the 360 was not great. If that mattered to you, that was a thing. But I know that for me personally, there were two things. First of all, the fact that it came out early, somehow they made that work. Like previously it had been shown, well, I shouldn't say, because PlayStation 2 kind of had that happening too. But like looking at like the Dreamcast or the Saturn.
9999.
Yeah. But I remember like I didn't pay for my 360, not because they sent one to me, but because I won it. If you remember, they were giving those things away.
You won
the
it?
beginning. Yeah. So when when the 360 was about to launch, they had this huge campaign where I think it was Mountain Dew and Doritos, of course, where you could, I think it was Mountain Dew, and I can't remember exactly, but where you could buy either of those products and you would get a code. And then you could go to a website and you could input that code and I think there was a draw I think in the US it was every hour, and I think in Canada it was every day or something along those lines. They would give away one a day. And in the US, I think they were giving away one an hour or something like that. And I was freelancing at the time, so I was working from home, and sort of the crew that I hung out with realized, of course, most of those contests are no purchase necessary. So you could also go to a website and fill out an online survey, and it would generate a code, and there was no limit to the amount of times you could do that.
Wow.
So those of us who were working from home, I was doing surveys a dozen times a day, and the best thing is that the codes were good for the entirety of the giveaway. So you could either input the codes immediately as sort of, here's your ticket, best of luck, or you could shotgun blast them all into one drawing and up your chances. And that's how I got my 360. I ended up winning one of those draws.
Wow.
So, and they sent out like the system, and I think it came with Call of Duty 2 and I want to say Ridge Racer 6.
PGR 3 was a launch title.
Maybe PGR 3. Yeah, it was one of those. But anyway, it was like, that's how I got my 360. But I mean, that too, everybody I knew that was happening and were actually in on that and trying. And a lot of people I knew won consoles.
Wow.
Because of that. So again, they were giving it away, right? Like
my dad bought one like a sucker.
But yeah, the red ring thing too. Like it was a pain in the ass, but they managed to turn it into something like kind of like a positive PR thing. It's like, we care about you. You know what I mean? We're going to make sure that you get a new Xbox. So,
well, it's good to see that I wasn't like total like fanboy vision in that time. I like looking back on it, like I don't know how it worked. I remember being like, I don't know how old I would have been, like 16 or 15, and Jay Allard's like, the console's designed with a dual concavity to simulate an inhale of breath. And I'm just like, oh my God, that's so awesome. Which, like, saying it out loud is pretty embarrassing because it's not really that awesome. But yeah, no, that's cool to see. And then the PlayStation 3 obviously did come out, and one of the main differences between the PS3 and the Xbox 360 is that it again switched to a different form of media. Like the media format is different with Blu-ray. So there are advantages to Blu-ray. I don't think they really reared their head in that generation necessarily, but I'm curious because you seem to be, at least previous gens, very into that conversation in terms of analyzing like what the types of media are being used to run these games. And I'm wondering if that ever really played a factor for you, DVD versus Blu-ray, and not from a movie perspective, because that's the reason why everyone bought a PS3, because 360 was better, right? That was literally what I said to anyway. Yeah, I'm wondering if that was a big part of your thought process in terms of where you wanted to play specific games, maybe multi-platform games, or was that a reason why you were excited for PS3? Was the format thing just carrying it back to the laser or the Sega CD?
I was excited for PS3 because it was Sony. For the same reason I was excited for the Saturn back in the 90s was that, I liked the Xbox a lot, but I still played more PlayStation 2 because I was more into the sort of the Japanese games that came out. And I had mentioned earlier, you got some real oddball stuff coming out near the end of that system's life, which I really enjoyed, like stuff like Gitaru Man and Mad Maestro and stuff like that, like just weird games that would never come here. Katamari Damacy, that sort of thing. And at that point too, and I still am to this day, I just buy the consoles that come out. I was at that point where, because I was in my late 20s now. I was pushing 30, and it's like, well, I'm just going to buy both. But I think what was really interesting and what I remember the most about the launch of both those systems, first of all, I remember the PS3 launch being really disappointing. I don't remember a game really standing out that I super enjoyed. The other thing was, I was in game development at the time, and the interesting thing to me was that one of the reasons to buy the PS3 was it was more powerful. And I think from a raw horsepower perspective, and I don't know specs very well, but from raw horsepower, it was more powerful than the 360. But Microsoft had done such a good job of getting that 360 out there and getting that sort of really strong market base that really most game developers, if you're making your game for both consoles, your target platform was the 360 because it was weaker. You know what I mean? Because it had to run well on the 360. If you made it so it could only run well on the PS3, then you had a huge chunk of the market that you weren't going to reach, or you're going to reach with a shoddy version of your game, right? So, and then the Wii was kind of at that point when you were developing Wii games, you were actually looking at GameCube code base more than anything else because they were just not on the same level. But yeah, so I think being more powerful and being really hard to develop for, along with how brutally arrogant Sony was when they were releasing it. If you remember when they were talking about the PS3 and they released the price and there was a huge backlash on the price, one of the executives, and it might have been Kaz Hirai, I don't remember, said PS3 is going to be so popular that people will get second jobs to buy one.
Yeah, it was him.
And I remember, and I don't know if you curse on this show or not, but I remember so many people, including myself, being like, "Fuck you, man! Like that's not. I'm not down with that. Like that's not cool." And then it came out, and it was sort of such a as I remember, and maybe I'm wrong, it just seemed like such a non-event when it launched. I stood in line for one, and I got that and a Wii on the same day because again, they launched on the same day, and I really lucky that I managed to get both on launch. And I was just so not enamored with either of them when it came out. I was back on my 360 almost immediately. And I think one of the other things for me personally, and I think for sort of the mass market in general, that Microsoft did so perfectly on the 360 was two things. Achievements.
Yep.
Were massive. And Xbox Live in general. Again, they took Xbox Live to the next level. And in the first year or two of the 360, I know a lot of the games that I played, I wouldn't have played. And the only reason I did is because me and my friends, and I think the market as a whole migrated from game to game because we could all see what everybody was playing. And we could all see what everybody was getting for achievements. And it's like, I know that, I'm playing Call of Duty. I'm playing Call of Duty 2 on a harder difficulty than I would normally because you need to play it on the hard difficulty to get the achievements. And I was so enamored with achievements that I wanted to do it. And then it's like, I'm looking on my friends list and it's like, everybody's playing Dead Rising. What the hell's Dead Rising? Right? And you go look it up and it's like, oh, okay, it's like this zombie shooter. All right, well, I'm going to play that now because everyone's playing it. And then everyone's playing Lost Planet. All right, I'll go play Lost Planet now. So I know I bought games that I wouldn't have bought because my friends were playing them, and it was brilliant. And it was another example of Microsoft just got that right, and it took Sony way too long to emulate them. And even when they did, they didn't do it right.
For sure. One thing I kind of wanted to pick your brain at, because again, like I was in a different, I had a different perspective, let's say, especially when it comes to what games I played during that era. I was pretending like I didn't like anything that came from Japan because this is the tail end, by the way, of me being a fanboy. Like halfway through this gen is when I smartened up, but we're not there yet. So I'm still like a pretty big degenerate at this point. But in terms of JRPGs, you had said that was kind of you up your alley. Like those are games that you enjoy, and you enjoyed what the PlayStation was offering in that regard. The early 360 days, like especially the first half of the 360, let's say, that's when Microsoft took the biggest swing they've ever taken in terms of getting exclusive content on from Japan on the Xbox 360. You had mentioned Katamari, like the next gen version of that game, I think was actually Xbox exclusive. They had a game, I think it's actually one of the last games made by Hironobu Sakaguchi, Final Fantasy creator, with Lost Odyssey, Blue Dragon, which has Akira Toriyama artwork. Last Revenant, I think, was a Square Enix JRPG that was exclusive. There's another one that I'm blanking on. Infinite Undiscovery. I had to look up my shelf there.
Oh, yeah,
that was also a JRPG from Square Enix. Like I don't think any of these games are necessarily like generational titles, although I really, really think Lost Odyssey actually might be. But there was actually a really, in terms of number of titles, JRPG specifically, I think that what they were releasing exclusively was pretty on par in terms of what games Sony were releasing in the first few years. Because I don't think there was really any JRPGs that Sony released that were exceptional in the first half either, like the Final Fantasy 13, which isn't very much loved by Final Fantasy fans, but those games also came on Xbox as well. So there was actually a ton of JRPGs there, and I'm wondering if you played those games and they just weren't good, or there's just kind of the stigma from the past generation where they didn't have that. And if you want to play a JRPG, you play it on PlayStation.
No, and for me, it kind of shifted, and the big reason why is because I started having kids.
They're long.
Yeah. So, I didn't have the time to play. I am you're talking about how you're a retired fanboy. I am a retired JRPG player. Unfortunately, I still love them, but I just don't have that kind of time. I'm not willing to put that kind of time in. Now that my kids are older, maybe I'll start doing it again. But no, you're right. You're absolutely right. And it's so funny that you're saying that, hearing you say that, because you totally sound like those of us who were Genesis kids back in the early 90s saying like, you'd hear, well, there's no RPGs on the Genesis. Like, yes, there is. And then you just like rattle off like 10 of them.
I never played any of those games. I just know they're there because I had to have this argument all the time on GameFAQs.
Yeah. Oh my God. GameFAQs. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think it came down to, again, it was more PlayStation 3 for me was because I just bought all the consoles. Now, having said that, by the end of that generation, the PlayStation 3 had really come on. Sony really turned that around. And again, a lot of it had to do with their own games. You know what I mean? Like, I was a big fan of the Uncharted series on the PlayStation 3. The Last of Us came out near the end of the PlayStation 3, which is one of my favorites. And there was some great Ratchet and Clank games on the PlayStation 3. There was Infamous. So, I mean, they had a lot of great series going on that system as well. It became very strong. It just took a long time to get there. And on the flip side, Microsoft in that generation started out so strong that, I think the balance came very close to balance by the end of that generation, I think. But it absolutely tipped in Microsoft's favor at the beginning of it.
For sure. Yeah, they kind of switch roles in the latter half where Microsoft was being extremely arrogant. Forza, Halo, Gears, that's all we need. And Sony was being very generous and very experimental with the games they were making. They were making extremely cinematic games that were not necessarily long and weren't going to be evergreen titles like Halo or Gears or Forza, but they were going to be very spectacular games. And then obviously I think one of the biggest TSN turning points was PS Plus, which is kind of a progenitor almost to Game Pass, and just that generosity, that like customer focus, all the stuff they weren't doing in the first half, they did, and then I don't think they won. I don't think anybody won that generation. I think that's a generation, maybe one of the only ones where you could point to both and say they tied. Because I think even
did the Wii win?
No, what the Wii? I say that with you can't see this on the podcast, but I literally have a stack of Wii games.
Stack of Wii games next to you. I know. It's like
no, I'm trying to get my daughter to play video games, and I'm striking out on everything. So I dug a Wii out of my closet. I'm gonna boot. My Wii Sports disc, I guess, did fell out of the case. It just doesn't work anymore. So I have to find another one. But yeah, anyway, that's why I have a stack of Wii games here. I think Wii was running. You might disagree, but I think Wii was running a different race. I think they won their race, but I don't think it was the same race.
No, I absolutely agree. And I mean, we haven't really touched on that for this era at all because, we haven't really talked too much about GameCube. Well, I guess we did a little bit, but this was absolutely the time when Nintendo was like, okay, you guys go do the horsepower race. That's fine. We're going to go do our own thing because we're Nintendo and we can. I don't feel like Sony and Microsoft could do what Nintendo does and be as successful. For whatever reason, Nintendo just does it right and people keep sticking with them, and I don't blame them. Nintendo makes amazing games. So, but yeah, we started out super strong. They were definitely marketing to a completely different group. I'm glad I had one, but again, I was going through before we recorded tonight and sort of listing like, oh, what were the big Wii games for me? And I came up with 2. So, I was not all in on the Wii at all. And then the Wii U was exactly the same way. So,
yeah. So speaking of games, before we move on to the final quarter, was there what games were there that stood out? You had mentioned already some of the PGR2, for example, and early Xbox Live games, but we never really talked about any specific games outside of Uncharted, like you had mentioned earlier, for 360 PS3. I'm wondering, what are some of the titles there that really stood out to you or are memorable?
Yeah, outside of the ones that we already mentioned, I am a big fan of the BioShock series. I thought it was just incredible when it came out, and I will die on the hill of saying BioShock 2 is an excellent game. I don't think people like that game nearly as much as they should, personally. You're waiting to say something.
So this is going to turn into another conversation, so I'll let you finish this thought, but I'll just give a preview. I think BioShock is one of the best games ever. And one of my main memories from that, which is kind of interesting, I think, is I saw BioShock on a website or whatever, but I had to go to work. And there was this video, I think, that you had, because I don't think YouTube was there yet. So you had to download the video to watch it, and I couldn't download the video because I didn't have time because I had to go to work. But I could download Major Nelson Radio because that was a smaller file. I had enough time to do that. I wouldn't be late for work. So I downloaded this weird thing called a podcast, Major Nelson Radio podcast, where they talked about BioShock and they interviewed Ken Levine. And I went to work, and while I was lubing up and cleaning the TCBY frozen yogurt machine at the movie theater, I was listening to them talk about BioShock, and that was the first podcast I ever listened to. And I think that in this era, there might be some podcast related stuff we could talk to. That's why I didn't want to derail it. So I'll let you finish talking about games, and we can head over to that. Sure, I never played BioShock 2, although I did play Infinite, and I love both.
It's really good. But people
I'll
don't
play it.
Give it the love it should. A couple of the games that really stand out for me on both systems, and I'm just going to sort of run through, is Beyond Good and Evil from Ubisoft. I thought was fantastic. Alan Wake, I really, really loved Alan Wake. Portal for me is one of the Portal and Portal 2 from that generation are fantastic. And the Forza series, especially though Forza Horizon, at the end of the 360, right near the end of its life, is when Forza Horizon came out. I'm a big racing fan, and I always have been. I hated where open world racing games were going at that point. The Need for Speed franchise in particular, I was just absolutely done with. And then Forza Horizon came out, and it's basically, it was like somebody went into my brain and said, okay, everything he doesn't like about open world racing games, we're going to take that all out of our game and just release something that's simple and straightforward and fun. We're going to get rid of all the stupid cop chases and, the in Burnout where you touch something and your car is destroyed. We're going to get rid of all that and just let you drive around the countryside and run races and listen to great music and I absolutely adore that game. And then like the other thing that I really loved that was happening around this time, and it's more prevalent in the last quarter, but it was sort of happening now, is you were starting to see more indie games hitting. So smaller experiences, actually in 360 in general, live arcade, I think, is another big thing that they did great. Which I don't think we really touched on, but the whole idea of relatively cheap games. Now they got a lot bigger and a lot more expensive by the end of the generation, but like cheap games, a lot of them based on old arcade games that you could buy, download really fast, which was important. And they were easy to store, but you were starting to see the rise of indie games, stuff like as well, like Papo and Yo for me really stands out. And remakes of older stuff that I love, like the Castle of Illusion and DuckTales remakes were happening in that generation. So those are all on my list too. Big fan.
Cool. And before I do want to talk this, like, I might be wrong, but this is kind of when Player One started, right? Around.
Yep.
Yeah.
One of
So
the
before
earliest episodes we did was my co-host CJ was going out and talking to people who were in line for their PlayStation 3s and Wiis.
Oh, really? That's really cool. I miss standing in line for stuff, man.
I don't.
I even went to lineups that I wasn't like. Again, this is the last quarter I'm going to be able to talk about my fanboy past, so I had to bring this up too. I used to go because, like, I wasn't just a console fanboy; I was like also a game fanboy. So obviously, I love Halo, which means I can't love Call of Duty. So during the Call of Duty midnight launches, this might be irrelevant to listeners, but where we live, there's a Best Buy and a Future Shop that are like basically separated by their parking lots. And I would drive past the lineup, like in a circle, driving past each lineup, blasting the Halo theme song.
Oh my God.
Well, with a Halo helmet on, like a cheap Halloween store one, for like 30 minutes.
Was that you I saw on the news?
I hope it made the news, but it probably. But yeah. Anyway, standing in line's cool. Before I do want to talk about the podcast, but before I do that, actually, you know what? No, let's just talk about the podcast, because talking about that made me completely forget what I was going to ask you. So yeah, Player One podcast started right around the same time as things like Gamertag Radio, Major Nelson Radio. All of like the longest tenured podcasts that you can find that are related to video games. Like this is, like I had mentioned, this is around the time when I listened to my first podcast, and I was like a techie kid. So I wasn't like late to the party by a lot. It was a blooming thing. It was just starting, and you were right at ground zero. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I mean, really what happened, so I had left Ziff Davis right around the time that 1UP was starting, 1UP.com. I had to go because of my work visa. I had to leave. And I got into game development after that for a few years. A little bit after that, Chris Johnston, who was also a long time, I mean, he'd been at EGM for like 15 years. He moved on as well, and he was working at... I forget what it was called. It was an anime magazine down in Texas. And I was freelancing for him during this time as well. And that was around the time that Ziff Davis's and 1UP's podcasts were becoming a big thing. But he and I had stayed in constant touch. We've always been close since we first started working with each other at EGM. We would play Burnout online together, actually, talking about Xbox Live. We played Burnout a lot, and that's how we would chat. And really the way it launched is that I ended up getting married in 2006. I ended up getting married in 2006, and he actually came up to my wedding, and we were sort of hanging out and chatting while he was here and talking about the podcast. And we were both saying, like, you know, our conversations when we're on playing Burnout and stuff, that could be a podcast. Why not? And that was really it. We decided at that moment that we were going to try it. When we started out, we were using the headsets that came with SOCOM on the PlayStation 2.
Nice.
That was all we had for audio gear and microphones. And yeah, and it didn't take off right away, but we decided we were going to brute force it and just keep going and keep going and keep going. And we eventually brought on another Ziff Davis alumnus, Phil Theobald, who's our other co-host now. He was a special guest host for about 3 years for some reason, and then we just decided to start calling him co-host. And it just sort of what it has turned into is, as we've all gotten into our 40s, and all gotten married, and one of us got divorced and had kids, and it's kind of become this like old school old man, we've been gaming for 40 years sort of, we're dads now and this is how things have changed. So it's not about it's really about 3 old friends getting together every week at this point who just happen to be really big gamers. But it's definitely not like what's the latest news, punditry. There's an element of that, but there's just as much talking about what our kids are playing, and the trials and tribulations of sort of having them grow up and be gamers. Like you're talking about how you're trying to get your little one to play video games, and now you've resorted to breaking out the Wii and trying to find a copy of Wii Sports, like that sort of thing. Like where our kids are a little older, sort of navigating the pitfalls of playing Roblox and all the jerk stores that are on Roblox trying to rip these little kids off of their items and that sort of thing. Like, that's what it's about. And it's been going for actually, I think we're like 2 episodes away from 15 years.
Yeah. Point. It's crazy, man. Like there's not many podcasts that have that tenure. There's a lot of gaming podcasts that come and go. There's like less than 10 I can think of, less than 5 I can think of that has been around for that long and kept going, which is really good. And it's also awesome that there's not any of the BS that you hear a lot in the game space now. It's very real. It's very it's what like an average gamer would want to hear, like someone who's doesn't want to get caught up in all of that stuff. And also on top of that, I know that I'm going to give you like time to self promo at the end, but I'm going to do some more self promo for you here anyway. They're also extremely welcoming to new podcasters and helpful to new podcasters. You have a lot of guests on your show. CJ in particular was really, really helpful, and you as well. Really, really helpful for me when I first started. I got a lot of information and resources from them, a lot of connections made through the Player One community. It's just really, really, really awesome. So I wanted to mention that here, but I did remember what I was going to ask earlier. And that was, you said you had switched over from games journalism to game development in this era. And I'm just wondering, if you had any cool stories or anything you wanted to share with that, but also being like, you had said that being in games journalism didn't necessarily affect your opinion on games or how you enjoyed games or anything like that. And if anything, it just allowed you to play more games and feed your hobby even more. But I'm wondering, when you get a chance to look under the hood and see how they're made and like see how the hot dog is made or whatever, if that had changed your perception of games or at any way in all, good or bad, impacted your hobby.
I think it impacted it in a really positive way. And the reason why is I always kind of prided myself on not being mean when I was covering games, especially bad games. Like nobody sets out to make a bad video game, obviously. There's so many, and this really fits software as a whole, software development as a whole, but talking about video games where it's like, you have a finite budget, you have a finite amount of time, you have a finite amount of people, you don't want to kill them by crunching them like crazy, although that's very common in the game industry. And as a journalist, you would sometimes see the games in progress, although you wouldn't get the context of what had happened and how you got there. But at the end of the day, you're reviewing this product without the context of what might have gone wrong or what decisions were made or changed at the last minute or that sort of thing. So when I got into game development, because I got an invitation to join a team at Vicious Cycle to work on the second Robotech game. I'm a huge Robotech fan. Like that is one of when I was a kid, I just adored that series. I still do. I still watch it watch through it like every year. And they knew that because I had covered their first Robotech game when I was at EGM. And they said, well, why don't you come work on this one? And I kind of really got to see that the end product for Robotech Invasion wasn't great. It was good. It was okay. But I mean, living through, what the grand plans were and then having to come back down to earth based on budget and time, as well as a little bit of feature creep at the end, and then seeing how the press reacted to that, which really hurt. It definitely adjusted my worldview when it came to game development in the games industry. And that's not me saying that, video game journalists suck or anything like that, because they have to rate a product based on what they think their readership, what helps their readership. in service of their readership. But it really sort of opened my eyes to the things that can happen in software development and in game development. So I'm really happy for my time in games development. I don't really miss it, to be honest. But it opened my eyes a lot, and it definitely made me a different gamer, as far as how I judge things and how quick I am to judge things.
For sure. And I don't have the exact same experience. I am a software developer, obviously. You knew that, but even though it's not making games, it's still making software. And I've only been doing it for a little while, I think 4 or 5 years, but it definitely changed my perspective on developers in general and the stuff that they have to go through. Because what I do is like so like pales in comparison to what game developers do in terms of the complexity, the work that they have to do in terms of like just how much work, the pressure, and like like I work at a fantastic place with fantastic balance and not a lot of pressure. And but even that I can see I'm making very small things and gauging people's reactions to it. And even seeing some little negative things is upsetting. And I couldn't imagine releasing something that's in the public eye and putting all that work into it. And a lot of times like you said, no one like sets out to make a bad game. And a lot of the times the decisions that get made that result in the game being bad or an aspect of the game being bad is usually not made by the people that actually implement or design or develop that feature or game or whatever. So yeah. And that's doubling back again to Player One podcast. I think that it's not only you that has that outlook, it's the whole cast of the show. That's another reason why I really, really like listening to that. Because even when there is bad news or there is a game that's not great, you'll either kind of politely explain the problems with it, or B, look for the good and stuff. And honestly, that's part of the inspiration for my entire channel in the first place. So
yeah, which I love.
Yeah, it's good to see that stuff. Now, was there any other things that you wanted to quickly mention in Q3 before we jump into the final quarter of your life?
I think the main thing was, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, I changed also as a gamer based on, I look at sort of where I was at the beginning of that, throughout this quarter, but it definitely changed near the end. I started having kids in 2007, and that really, really changes how much free time you have and how much money you have. And it really changed me even more as a gamer. I absolutely, by the end of this quarter, went from anything I'm remotely interested in, I'm going to buy and play as much as I can, to this upcoming quarter, which is more of like the amount of games I buy in a year is probably less than 10 at this point, give or take. But it had absolutely everything to do with having children and having to raise them.
Yeah, no, it's definitely throws a wrench in your gaming life for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that being said, we have one more quarter to talk about, and that will be from 2010 to present day. But before we start, let's put one more coin into that arcade time machine and take a look at what gaming is like nowadays.
Clear?
This is my favorite part. Exciting.
Eyes up, Guardian. It worked. You're alive. You're gonna see a lot of things you won't understand.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Game Awards.
Fuck the Oscars, you know? Fuck the Oscars!
And the winner for Game of the Year 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 is...
Xbox Nights.
Evil is evil. Lesser, greater, middling, makes no difference.
Evil the hell can conjure. All the wickedness that mankind can produce. We send unto them only you.
Don't worry, loves. Cavalry's here.
How you share your games on PS4.
Boy.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
Ladies and gentlemen, introducing Xbox One.
TV and movies? TV. Xbox. Watch TV.
Sports. Sports.
Sport. Television.
Call of Duty. Call of Duty. Call of Duty. Call of Duty.
Hey, you. You're finally awake.
Today, I'm pleased to announce Xbox One backward compatibility. Project Scorpio will be the next addition to the Xbox One family.
Xbox Game Pass, a way to give gamers the ultimate freedom to play.
ZeniMax has an amazing track record of building great games. Next holiday, Xbox Series X will lead us into the future of console gaming.
I think you are now ready to hear what happened 100 years ago.
2010 to where we are right now. A king falls and a new one rises as PlayStation takes over after the 360's reign comes to an end. But desperate times call for desperate measures as Xbox looks to level the playing field with Game Pass, all while Nintendo switches things up once again. Greg, in this era of your life, the final era, what devices
not
did
the final era?
What devices did you game on? What was your favorite? And do you remember how you got them?
What year did the Xbox One come out?
2013.
2013. Oh my god. Okay. I got an Xbox and Xbox One and a PlayStation 4. I pre-ordered them. I didn't stand in line for them this time. And I got to say that I was absolutely PlayStation 4 almost all the way through that era. The Xbox One was an absolute mess when it came out, which I know you and I have talked about offline. Hate to say it. I was ready for it to be great. But yeah, it was just, they didn't know what they wanted to do with that. And it hurt even more that it was a Canadian that was at the helm at the time. But
he's no Jeff Keighley.
Yeah, exactly. But I still played a fair amount of games on the Xbox One, but I was definitely a PS4 guy. And it was all about, I think what came home to roost there and what I really like about what's changed in the past couple of years is that during the 360 era, near the end, I think Microsoft cut a lot of developers loose and they canceled a lot of games. And now we see that they've bought a bunch of studios. They've acquired a bunch of studios again. They're really pushing their first party stuff. And that's fantastic. Problem with something like that is it pays dividends after a long time. It's not immediate. Right. Whereas Sony is still churning out these fantastic first party games, even up into the Series X and PlayStation 5 eras. And of course, Nintendo's over on the side doing their Nintendo thing, and it's working for them. I can't believe it's working for them, but it is. And I say that as someone who plays a lot of Switch.
I just bought an OLED Switch today.
Did you really? There you go, right?
Yeah, I haven't played my Switch in a year. I just bought an OLED Switch today for no reason.
Oh, I think it's just one of the most uncomfortable consoles to hold and play.
Yeah,
ever. But it's good. So yeah, I mean, I've definitely been very much a PlayStation gamer this era for sure.
Cool. Was there any particular PlayStation games that stood out? They often get praised a lot, rightfully so, but sometimes detractors will say that they just make the same game over and over again. You had already mentioned that you really like Uncharted, as do I. I think it's one of the best franchises of all time. But was there any other PlayStation games that really stand out to you?
I mean, yeah, you know what? You're kind of right. I know for me, the Ratchet and Clank games are still huge. The latest one was fantastic. One of the things, though, for PlayStation 4 and has carried on to PlayStation 5 a little bit is VR. I jumped into PlayStation VR both feet and have not regretted it. I don't play it constantly, but when I do play it, I always love it. Especially stuff like Astrobot and Moss and Batman. There have been some great experiences. I haven't played Iron Man yet, but I'm definitely keeping that near the top of the list. And I think there was another one that just came out from 17-bit today. I forget what it's called, Song of something or other, but yeah, I want to check that out too. So that was a big reason why, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I don't think it's unfair to say that they keep not necessarily making the same game over and over again, but they're definitely churning out sequels to established franchises, which Nintendo is as well. I mean, that's what Nintendo does. But they're always high quality.
such high quality.
You know, I mean, you can't deny it.
Yeah. I convinced myself that the Xbox One was great. I convinced myself that always online was good because of you can share licenses with people, and the Kinect is a space camera it's going to be awesome. But even I like couldn't hold on forever. I got a PS4, and the last half of that generation, up until probably Game Pass, I played less Xbox in that span than I had since the Xbox had come out, by like a factor of like 3 or 4 times. It wasn't that they made a lot of good, like they made good games, because they did. It's that they would make a good game, and then before you finished it, they have just released another one that's just as good, if not better, which is, it's unbelievable the quality and quantity that they were able to put out. All of them are, for the most part, like third person action adventure, gritty, realistic games, but I think they separate themselves enough with their characters and story that every single one of them is worth playing. So yeah, I'm in the same boat as you.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I would say too, one of the other games that, and actually series now, that I didn't mention in there too, is Spider-Man. My God, they made an amazing Spider-Man game, and Miles Morales as the follow-up too. Like, just chef's kiss, like so good.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. That's I'm a huge Batman fan, but I don't know if I can say that Arkham is better than Spider-Man. I just, the one complaint I had with Spider-Man that really affected my experience with it, and I don't want to like turn this into Spider-Man podcast, but they showed way too much in the trailers. So the big event at the end, I already knew was coming. If I didn't know that, I think the game would be the best superhero game of all time, because that would have hit a lot harder.
I feel like Sony, and I mean Microsoft does this a little bit as well. I feel like that's one of Sony's biggest shortcomings right now. It's one of the things, at least, that bothers me the most about them, is that they have a tendency to show a game really early and then just
often
keep showing it and showing. Yeah. Like I know with Last of Us 2, the last couple times they showed that game on our podcast on Player One, we were saying it to each other. It's like, I don't want to see it anymore.
Yeah.
Just
I stopped
release it.
watching them. Yeah. I didn't watch
exactly. Like, so that is a big problem I find that they have. Microsoft does it a little bit as well. Nintendo is now on the other spectrum, where it's like, hey, here's this big game that you didn't even know was coming, and it's coming out tomorrow. It's like,
Metroid Dread. Yeah. Yeah. No, 100% agree. Deathloop, another example of a game they showed off like 8,000 times. One thing I wanted to talk about a little bit with this generation too, and this again could be completely wrong. I didn't have a big perspective on the industry in probably the first half of your gaming life, but I feel like gaming culture has changed significantly in this quarter. Maybe more so. I think there's an argument to be made that maybe more so than any previous culture when it evolves. Like, the significance of the change, I think, is pretty big. We're moving into a lot of free-to-play games, which is a huge difference between how we used to play games. Now there's services like Game Pass, there's streaming culture with Twitch culture and stuff like that. And then games in general are not releasing as a product that you buy and play and then move on. They're releasing as something you buy and play and stay in forever. Games as a service is one of the pillars of the gaming industry now, for better or worse. So I'm wondering how any of that applies to you as somebody who has probably, I don't want to say spent like the better years of your life playing like games in a specific way, but the years of your life where you could play games the most, which I think is pretty true. Like, those years are gone for me too. But now it's changed to games where you can't just buy a game nowadays. For the most part, play it, beat it, and move on. And you're playing it until the DLC comes out, or you have to constantly log in for whatever reason. I'm wondering if you even engage with that stuff now, or how that's affected how you play games.
I feel like because I've had this question asked on a few different podcasts, and I feel like, somebody, as you said, the time that I could sit and play a game as much as I wanted, which I would say was my 20s and early 30s, is gone. And I'm looking forward to my 50s and 60s when my kids are grown and I have all the time in the world to do it again. But I feel like the answer is supposed to be like, oh, gaming was better 20, 30 years ago, blah, 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 blah. And I still personally prefer the whole sit down, play it, finish it, move on. And for the most part, that's what I play. Like, the most recent game that I played was Kena, Bridge of Spirits, which is exactly that. It's like, I don't know, maybe a 10-hour game, kind of a Zelda style. It's an open world, start to finish. It's linear. It's open world, but it's still pretty linear. And for the most part, my gaming hasn't changed from that perspective. I do like the always online thing. I know that in the last 10 years, one of the things that has really changed as far as the way that I game is I do a lot of online racing, which I did a little bit before, but now I really concentrate on it. Like, I've been playing Codemasters Formula One games every single year for, I don't know how long it's been going now, 11 years. Actually, when I'm done talking to you tonight, I'm going to jump on and run a Grand Prix with a friend of mine with our co-op career. And Gran Turismo Sport, I've been part of a league that grew up out of Player One podcast for like 10 years now in the Gran Turismo games. But I personally feel like the way it's changed for me is I actually really like how much choice I have. I'm not a free-to-play gamer. I'm not a games as a service guy for the most part. But I think this era, in the last 10 years, as gamers, we have so many more options now than we ever had. And you can be whatever kind of gamer you want. Yes, not every game is a sort of a linear single player, start to finish, move on kind of game. But I feel like there's still so many of them that at least for somebody who has the relatively limited amount of time I give myself for gaming, there's more than enough. I still can't play everything I want to play. But you know, like I, at the same time, if you want to be a first person shooter guy, you know, then like, I know that you're really looking forward to when Halo Infinite comes out, right? I mean, that's a thing, or Call of Duty or Fortnite, like those kinds of games. My son used to love Fortnite. And because of that, I was exposed to it, and I don't really play it, but I got to watch him play it, and I got to see kind of what that game is, that service is, and appreciate it for what it is. You know, you can like it or hate it, but I understand what they're doing and they do it well. Or even mobile game. I don't do mobile gaming. I did a little bit of mobile game development for a while, but like, I know a lot of people who will pick up a free to play game, not necessarily to go spend lots of money on it, but because it's free and it's a time waster, you know, which really kind of harkens back to where we started 30 or 40 years ago, you know, where it's like you drop a quarter in because it'll give you 5 minutes of pleasure and then you're done. And it's kind of, I think a lot of the free to play stuff isn't necessarily exactly the same, but I think it's pushing the same buttons. Again, for better or worse, there's a whole conversation around whale hunting and all that sort of thing when it comes to free to play that, you know, I have opinions on, everyone has opinions on. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but for the most part, I just feel like nowadays you've got so much choice, and you can kind of just play whatever you want. Almost every niche has good coverage. And if you need games that are single player and you only have 5 hours and you want to finish it in 5 hours, you have tons of options. If you want to get online and shoot people for 12 hours a day, you have tons of options. Like, it's fantastic.
Yeah, for sure. And that's interesting. I never actually thought to compare mobile games to the arcade with that whole kind of mental switch thing. I think that actually makes a lot of sense. And that's that. I just wanted to highlight that because I thought that was a really interesting analogy. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time left in quarter four because we are at 2.5 hours now. And I know you got a race to run. But one thing I did want to mention, because I'm assuming that this came into your life in this quarter, was Extra Life. Mm-hmm. I know that Extra Life is a big part of your life, I guess, right now. You're like a champion, extreme, mega Extra Life. I don't know what the actual title is. Probably something better than that. But wondering when it was in this quarter that you got introduced to Extra Life. Was it like what drew you to that? And how is that all going?
Yeah, I've been doing it for 11 years now. So yeah, it was pretty much this quarter that it started. And really the way it started was I had done some fundraising for Child's Play, which is the Penny Arcade charity that I don't know if that's still going or not. I thought that was a good idea. It's like, hey, let's use gaming to do some good, because that happened around the same time that so much negative crap was happening. But really, I got introduced to Extra Life through a fellow podcaster and content creator named TJ Lauerman, who goes by the hacker alias That Sports Gamer, who was doing Extra Life that first year, which I think was the second year of the charity, and had put together a team and reached out and said, like, would you be interested? I'd love you to join my team. I think I raised like $700 that year. And it's kind of a near and dear charity to my heart. So anyone who doesn't know what Extra Life is, it's a Children's Miracle Network charity, and it's worldwide, which means that basically when you sign up for it, you choose which hospital you want any donations you receive to go to, any children's hospital. So I love that aspect of it, and that I can support my local children's hospital. As a father, as a father of 3, knowing that I can do something to support my local children's hospital is a big deal to me. I've used it a lot. And, as someone who had a younger brother who actually spent a lot of his life at the local children's hospital before he passed at a very young age, that was kind of what started me on the path. And yeah, so now I'm in my 11th year. I think I've raised something like $80,000 in the last 11 years on this charity. Yeah. And it's just something that I love to do. And at the end of the day, I'm sitting my ass down on my chair and playing video games, which I would be doing anyway. So if I can turn that into some good in the world, then I don't see why not.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I knew you were big into it. I'm trying to also be into it, because as soon as you spend, like, for those who don't know, the IWK is the children's hospital that's in our area, and like anyone who has a kid goes through that. If you go to there for any reason, whether it's like having like the actual birth or like an illness or anything, they're so awesome there, and you go in there like so freaked out and so worried, and like they are just incredible. So knowing that and then seeing what you're able to do made me want to try and do what I can. I'm definitely not anywhere close to $80,000. That's actually the first time I heard that figure from you, which is freaking insane. Like, that's incredible. Like, hats off. And that's 80,000 and counting, because like every time I see your fundraising drives, it's just like you have those automatic tweets. I think they're automatic anyway, where when you get a big donation, they get tweeted out, and it's just like almost every day. It's awesome. So that's really, really good to see. But all right, Greg, we made it through all 4 quarters of your life. At this point, there's nothing left. As weird as that sounds to say. But we've made it through all 4 quarters. But I do have a couple of wrap-up questions here. Since we just spent 2 hours, 36 minutes, and 25 seconds talking about your favorite video games, I'm wondering if, with all of it being fresh in your mind, that you could tell me what your favorite game series is. Through your bone instead of picking one game.
Oh, wow. My favorite game series, I would probably have to say probably Gran Turismo. As weird as that sounds.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there,
if
like,
you asked me my favorite game, it wouldn't have been a Gran Turismo game, though.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess Gran Turismo has more legs, I guess, than Forza, because it's older. There's more titles, there's pieces of it in almost every era. So okay, that makes sense. I personally am not a huge racing game fan, but it also brings me into my next question. This is, again, a little bit of an assumption I'm making, but I know for sure, especially in like the 90s and like leading up into the early 2000s, that like for starters, first person shooters were not the most popular game. They were like a niche thing. MMOs were not the most popular game. They were even more of a niche thing. Like cinematic 3D action adventures weren't. It was platformers in the first half of that time frame that I spoke about, and then leading up into like the second half, it was sports games and racing games. Mm-hmm. Racing games, in my opinion, were probably the most popular games, because one, they were really good at showing off the consoles. So you could not release a console without having one. That's why Project Gotham exists. That's why Gran Turismo exists, because you have to have a exclusive racing game, because it was the first person shooter of that era. And I know from what you said earlier about in the first quarter that your dad and uncle had a race team, and I'm making like kind of connecting some dots here. I don't know if this is the reason why, but I'm assuming there's some connection between them owning a race team, you growing up around a race team, and your love for racing games. That's true, right?
Absolutely.
Well, I'm such a good detective.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Okay. Okay. So my question is, what does it feel like to have your favorite genre kind of be the most popular game for everybody, and then to keep that being your favorite genre, well, because right now it's not. Like right now, like you don't need a racing game to sell a console, and it's not the most important type of game. I would argue that games as a service, first person shooters, sports games, maybe even like some of the building games like Minecraft or Roblox. Like there's a lot of genres I think that are above racing games right now. I think racing games are actually more of a niche game. A lot of the fans of those are like more into like they really just like cars, and this is a way that they can drive cars that they can't drive in real life. You can get steering wheels. Like it's definitely a lot more niche. So I'm wondering how that feels like, because my favorite genre is first person shooters, and it's been king since it became my favorite genre. So I don't know what it's like to walk into like a room full of gamers and be like, hey, you check out Formula One from whatever game you're going to play after this, and everyone's like, I don't play racing games.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right. And you know what? I am so happy the way you described that, because I've been describing the racing genre like that for years. Because you're right, up until probably the last 10 years, when you launch a console with a racing game, because it's one of the easiest ways to show off the generational leap, right? Like, I mean, and going back to the second era we talked about when I was talking about renting the Genesis for the first time, one of the first games I rented was Super Monaco GP, and there was nothing like it on the NES, and yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you said it that way. You literally said it exactly the same way I've been saying it for years. Yeah, it's weird. And I think it has more to do with what I was saying earlier, where the size of the game industry and the variety in the game industry is so big now that it's not quite the same as it was like when you were saying, like, first person shooters came in and they were the biggest thing. And at one point racing games were the biggest thing, or mascot platformers, and those died in the mid 90s. And actually the late 90s, one of the things that you didn't mention, but I think is worth pointing out too, is one-on-one fighters.
Right.
Where,
exactly.
With Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, and those kind of those hit a dip for a while as well. And then they came back on vogue. But what I've been really interested to see over the last 10, 15 years, and fighters are definitely in this group as well, is the esports side of things. First person shooters are huge in the esports arena. And I found, especially with the pandemic, that actually gave racing games a little bit of a jolt, because a lot of us race fans who are used to watching NASCAR and Formula One and that sort of thing, well, those series were all shut down during the pandemic. And almost all those drivers, or a huge amount of them, were playing in sponsored, televised, or at least televised on the internet, esports events after that, right? Like,
really?
All the F1 drivers went and did. And the beautiful thing about that is that, I mean, those were happening anyway, but they kind of gave those esports a bit of a jump, where they're a thing. Like right now, on the F1 side, the F1 teams have esports divisions. They actually hire drivers to compete for them in esports. Same with NASCAR. A lot of NASCAR teams and NASCAR drivers have actual contracted esports drivers that race in iRacing or the NASCAR series, like the E series, and almost all of those YouTube channels televise those. You know what I mean? Like, so they're a thing, but I don't know that racing definitely isn't the most important genre, but there was a huge influx, of people during the pandemic, especially while these professional racers were doing it, going out and buying wheels and logging onto iRacing and, getting a cockpit set up and a triple monitor set up and all that sort of thing. And I think a lot of them have stuck with it. So yeah, not necessarily the most important genre in the traditional sense. Racing games aren't selling systems anymore, but I don't know what games are selling systems anymore from a particular genre. You know what I mean? Especially with crossplay now as well. But even looking at Gran Turismo, I mean, the biggest thing about Gran Turismo Sport that they advertised when that game came out on the PlayStation 4 was that it was going to be like an FIA approved series. So there's like a Gran Turismo E-League that's been going for years now as well, where you can actually and you can compete in that and try to qualify for those and that sort of thing too. And those are broadcast events as well. So I don't know that really answers the question. I think I've just sort of meandered down a road here, but but it's interesting to see where it's gone. It's the whole sitting alone in a room and racing against the AI that used to sell systems. Like Ridge Racer 5 sold me on a PlayStation 2 in a lot of ways. And, like you said, Project Gotham Racing 3 sold me on a 360 in a lot of ways. Those days are long gone. I don't think that's ever going to happen again. But I know personally, I can't wait for March 4th when Gran Turismo 7 comes out. It's, but I'm that guy who invested in the wheel and the racing seat and jumps on, like practices for his league race every 2 weeks and that sort of thing. So not as important as it was, but way more important to me now than it ever has been.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I guess like niche now is not the same as niche then. Like if you were a fan of a niche genre or a niche game, you might have to pop on IRC and find like a group of 10 people that might like the same game as you. But now I have no idea about racing games. I had no idea there was an E-League. There's probably subreddits for racing game fans with hundreds of thousands of people in there. Mm-hmm. So even though, yeah, it's niche, it just means it's hundreds of thousands and not millions and millions, which is still a ton of people. So I guess it probably hasn't hit as hard as otherwise could have. But yeah, that's all I got for now. Thanks so much, Greg, for joining. I hope you had a great time on the show. Before we say our goodbyes, though, I'd like to give the floor to you to let everyone know where they can find you, see all your work, and all of that stuff.
Yeah. So mainly, the podcast we were talking about earlier, Player One Podcast, which we're getting ready to record our 779th episode this week, where again, it's 3 X Games journalists, also X Games developers, all dads, all in their mid 40s, who talk about what they're playing, talk about some of the news of the day, and but it's all from the through the lens of middle-aged, longtime gamers. A lot of retro game talk on there as well. So yeah, that's playeronepodcast.com. That's we record and broadcast every Sunday night, but the podcast itself comes out on all the podcast services on Tuesday mornings every week. Also I have on my YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/Greg Sewart, is my history series called Generation 16, which chronicles the history of the Sega Genesis, game by game, one game at a time. I just finished 1990, so we're getting into 1991. That release is much more sporadic, but I release a lot of other content on that channel as well. So please consider coming over and watching that. And then 3 nights a week, I stream on Twitch for Extra Life to raise money for Extra Life. Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. I play on Mondays. I play old adventure games, the old Sierra and LucasArts stuff. Tuesdays, I just play random retro games from my way too big video game collection. And Thursdays, I play games that were requested by people who donated to Extra Life, called Donor Demand Thursdays. So Twitch TV/Sewart, SEWART, is where you can find me there. And this year's Extra Life 24-hour marathon is coming up on November 6th. It's going to be all about Xbox and GameCube games for 24 hours.
Ooh, Xbox. I know a thing or two about Xbox. Yeah, no, that's awesome. I just want to like kind of interject a little bit too, just to hammer the point home. The generation, the generation videos that he does, the history of the Sega Genesis videos that he does, are really, really awesome. Like it's not just like, oh, this game came out on this time and it was made by this person and it's this is the genre. There are deep dives into these games. And when he says he wants to cover every game, he's covering every game. When he says he's done 1990, he did every game that came out in 1990. And they're in-depth deep dives. So if you played a game on Sega Genesis in 1990, that game is there. They're really awesome. In terms of the Twitch channel, there's a lot of quote variety streamers that cycle between like two or three different games. This is a real variety show. There is so much random stuff on there, and like because of all the experiences that you've listened to so far and all the ones that are still buried deep in the recesses of his mind, there's tons of factoids and tons of things that you'll learn just from playing the game and listening to him and stuff like that. So I highly recommend checking that out. And of course, if you have any toonies or loonies to spare, Extra Life is a great cause, and he is, like I said, Extra Life champion. I also want to take a quick second to thank everyone who managed to make their way to the end of this video, this podcast. Really means a lot to me. If you enjoyed the show or have any comments or critiques, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or in the comment section below if you are listening to this on YouTube. And hey, while you're there, feel free to hit the subscribe button. I just hit 100. Next goal is 200 subscribers. So any help I can get to get there would be fantastic. Until next time, remember to have fun out there, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks again.